Chapter 21. The temporary stable, a wooden shed, had been put up close to the race course, and there his mare was to have been taken the previous day. He had not yet seen her there during the last few days. He had not ridden her out for exercise himself, but had put her in the charge of the trainer, and so now he positively did not know in what condition his mare had arrived yesterday, and was today. He had scarcely got out of his carriage when his groom, the so-called stable boy, recognizing the carriage some way off, called the trainer a dry-looking Englishman in high boots and a short jacket, clean-shaven, except for a tuft below his chin, came to meet him walking, with the uncouth gait of jockey, turning his elbows out and swaying from side to side. "Well, how's Frou-Frou?" Vronsky asked in English. "All right, sir," the Englishman's voice responded somewhere in the inside of his throat. "Better not go in," he added, touching his hat. "I've put a muzzle on her, and the mare's fidgety. Better not go in, it'll excite the mare." "No, I'm going in. I want to look at her." "Come along then," said the Englishman, frowning and speaking with his mouth shut, and with swinging elbows he went on in front with his disjointed gait. They went into the little yard in front of the shed. A stable boy, spruce and smart in his holiday attire, met them with a broom in his hand and followed them. In the shed there were 5 horses in their separate stalls, and Vronsky knew that his chief rival, Gladiator, a very tall chestnut horse, had been brought there and must be standing among them. Even more than his mare, Vronsky longed to see Gladiator, whom he had never seen. But he knew that by the etiquette of the race course, it was not merely impossible for him to see the horse, but improper even to ask questions about him. Just as he was passing along the passage, the boy opened the door into the second horse box on the left, and Vronsky caught a glimpse of a big chestnut horse with white legs. He knew that this was Gladiator, but with the feeling of a man turning away from the sight of another man's open letter, he turned round and went into Frou-Frou's stall. "The horse is here, belonging to Mac. I can never say the name," said the Englishman over his shoulder, pointing his big finger and dirty nail towards Gladiator's stall. "Matin, yes. He's my most serious rival," said Vronsky. "If you were riding him," said the Englishman, "I'd bet on you. Frou-Frou is more nervous." "He's stronger," said Vronsky, smiling at the compliment to his riding in a steeplechase. "It all depends on riding and on pluck," said the Englishman. "Of pluck, that is energy and courage." Vronsky did not merely feel that he had enough. What was of far more importance, he was firmly convinced that no one in the world could have more of this pluck than he had. "Don't you think I want more thinning down?" "Oh no," answered the Englishman. "Please don't speak loud. The mare's fidgety," he added, nodding towards the horse box before which they were standing, and from which came the sound of restless stamping in the straw. He opened the door, and Vronsky went into the horse box. Dimly lighted by one little window in the horse box stood a dark bay mare with a muzzle on, picking at the fresh straw, with her hoofs looking round him. In the twilight of the horse box, Vronsky unconsciously took in once more a comprehensive glance at all the points of his favorite mare. Frou-Frou was a beast of medium size, not altogether free from reproach. From a breeder's point of view, she was small-boned all over. Though her chest was extremely prominent in front, it was narrow. Her hind quarters were a little drooping, and in her forelegs, and still more in her hind legs, there was a noticeable curvature. The muscles of both hind and forelegs were not very thick, but across her shoulders the mare was exceptionally broad, a peculiarity especially striking now that she was lean from training. The bones of her legs below the knees looked no thicker than a finger from in front, but were extraordinarily thick seen from the side. She looked altogether, except across the shoulders, as it were pinched in at the sides and pressed out in depth, but she had in the highest degree the quality that makes all defects forgotten. That quality was blood, the blood that tells, as the English expression has it. The muscles stood up sharply under the network of sinews covered with the delicate mobile skin, soft as satin, and they were hard as bone. Her clean cut head with prominent bright spirited eyes broadened out at the open nostrils that showed the red blood, and the cartilage within about all her figure, and especially her head, there was a certain expression of energy, and at the same time of softness. She was one of those creatures which seem only not to speak, because the mechanism of their mouth does not allow them to. Vronsky, at any rate, it seemed that she understood all he felt at that moment. Looking at her directly, Vronsky went towards her. She drew in a deep breath, and turning back her prominent till the white looked bloodshot, she started at the approaching figures, from the opposite side, shaking her muzzle and shifting lightly from one leg to the other. "There you see how fidgety she is," said the Englishman. "There, darling, there," said Vronsky, going up to the mayor and speaking soothingly to her. But the nearer he came, the more excited she grew. Only when he stood by her head she was suddenly quieter, while the muscles quivered under her soft, delicate coat. Vronsky patted her strong neck, straightened over her sharp withers a stray lock of her mane that had fallen on the other side, and moved his face near her dilated nostrils, transparent as a bat's wing. She drew a loud breath and snorted out through her tense nostrils, pricked up her sharp ear, and put out her strong black lip towards Vronsky as though she would nip hold of his sleeve. But remembering the muzzle, she shook it and again began restlessly stamping one after the other her shapely legs. "Quiet, darling, quiet," he said, patting her again over her hind quarters, and with a glad sense that his mare was in the best possible condition, he went out of the horse box. The mayor's excitement had infected Vronsky. He felt that his heart was throbbing, and that he too, like the mayor, longed to move, to bite. It was both dreadful and delicious. "Well, I rely on you then," he said to the Englishman. "6:30 on the ground." "All right," said the Englishman. "Oh, where are you going, my lord?" he asked suddenly, using the title "my lord," which he'd scarcely ever used before. Vronsky, in amazement, raised his head and stared, as he knew how to stare, not into the Englishman's eyes, but at his forehead, astounded at the impertinence of his question, but realizing that in asking this the Englishman had been looking at him not as an employer, but as a jockey, he answered, "I've got to go to Brioni's. I shall be home within an hour." "How often I'm asked that question?" "Today," he said to himself, and he blushed, a thing which rarely happened to him. The Englishman looked gravely at him, and as though he too knew where Vronsky was going, he added, "The great thing is to keep quiet before a race," he said. "Don't get out of temper or upset about anything." "All right," answered Vronsky, smiling, and jumping into his carriage, he told the man to drive to Peterhof. Before he had driven many paces away, the dark clouds that had been threatening rain all day broke, and there was a heavy downpour of rain. "What a pity," thought Vronsky, putting up the roof of the carriage. "It was muddy before, now it will be a perfect swamp." As he sat in solitude in the closed carriage, he took out his mother's letter and his brother's note and read them through. Yes, it was the same thing over and over again. Everyone, his mother, his brother, everyone thought fit to interfere in the affairs of his heart. This interference aroused in him a feeling of angry hatred, a feeling he'd rarely known before. "What business is it of theirs? Why does everybody feel called upon to concern himself about me? And why do they worry me so, just because they see that this is something they can't understand? If it were a common, vulgar, worldly intrigue, they would have left me alone. They feel that this is something different, that this is not a mere pastime, that this woman is dearer to me than life, and this is incomprehensible, and that's why it annoys them. Whatever our destiny is, or maybe we have made it ourselves, and we do not complain of it," he said in the word "we," linking himself with Anna. "No, they must needs teach us how to live. They haven't an idea of what happiness is. They don't know that without our love for us there is neither happiness nor unhappiness, no life at all." He thought he was angry with all of them for their interference, just because he felt in his soul that all these people were right. He felt that the love that bound him to Anna was not a momentary impulse, which would pass as worldly intrigues do pass, leaving no other traces in the life of either, but pleasant or unpleasant memories. He felt all the torture of his own and her position, all the difficulty there was for them conspicuous, as they were in the eye of all the world, in concealing their love, in lying and deceiving, and in lying, deceiving, feigning, and continually thinking of others, when the passion that united them was so intense that they were both oblivious of everything else but their love. He vividly recalled all the constantly recurring instances of inevitable necessity for lying and deceit, which were so against his natural bent. He recalled particularly vividly the shame he had more than once detected in her at this necessity for lying and deceit, and he experienced the strange feeling that had sometimes come upon him since his secret love for Anna. This was a feeling of loathing for something, whether for Alexei Alexandrovich or for himself, or for the whole world, he could not have said, but he always drove away the strange feeling. Now too he shook it off and continued the thread of his thoughts. Yes, she was unhappy before, but proud and at peace, and now she cannot be at peace and feel secure in her dignity Though she does not show it, yes, we must put an end to it, he decided, and for the first time the idea clearly presented itself that it was essential to put an end to this false position, and the sooner the better. Throw up everything, she and I, and hide ourselves somewhere alone with our love, he said to himself. Chapter 20. To the rain did not last long, and by the time Vronsky arrived, his shaft horse trotting at full speed and dragging the trace horses galloping through the mud with their reins hanging loose, the sun had peeped out again. The roofs of the summer villas and the old lime trees in the gardens on both sides of the principal streets sparkled with wet brilliance, and from the twigs came a pleasant drip, and from the roofs rushing streams of water. He thought no more of the shower spoiling the race course, but was rejoicing now that thanks to the rain he would be sure to find her at home and alone, as he knew that Alexei Alexandrovitch, who had lately returned from a foreign watering place, had not moved from Petersburg. Hoping to find her alone, Vronsky alighted as he always did to avoid attracting attention before crossing the bridge, and walked to the house. He did not go up the steps to the street door, but went into the court. Has your master come? He asked a gardener. No, sir, the mistress is at home, but you will please go to the front door. There are servants there, the gardener answered. They'll open the door. No, I'll go in from the garden. And feeling satisfied that she was alone, and wanting to take her by surprise, since he'd not promised to be there today, and she would certainly not expect him to come before the races, he walked holding his sword and stepping cautiously over the sandy path bordered with flowers to the terrace that looked out upon the garden. Vronsky forgot now all that he had thought on the way of the hardships and difficulties of their position. He thought of nothing but that he would see her directly, not in imagination, but living all of her as she was in reality. He was just going and stepping on his whole foot so as not to creak up the worn steps of the terrace, when he suddenly remembered what he always forgot and what caused the most torturing side of his relations with her son, with his questioning, hostile, as he fancied eyes. This boy was more often than anyone else a check upon their freedom. When he was present, both Francie and Anna did not merely avoid speaking of anything that they could not have repeated before everyone. They did not even allow themselves to refer by hints to anything. The boy did not understand. They had made no agreement about this. It had settled itself. They would have felt it wounding themselves to deceive the child in his presence. They talked like acquaintances. But in spite of this caution, Vronsky often saw the child's intent, bewildered gaze fixed upon him, a strange shyness, uncertainty at one time, friendliness at another, coldness and reserve in the boy's manner to him, as though the child felt that between this man and his mother there existed some important bond, the significance of which he could not understand. As a fact, the boy did feel that he could not understand this relation, and he tried painfully, and was not able to make clear to himself what feeling he ought to have for this man. With a child's keen instinct for every manifestation of feeling, he saw distinctly that his father, his governess, his nurse, all did not merely dislike Vronsky, but looked on him with horror and aversion, though they never said anything about him, while his mother looked on him as her greatest friend. What does it mean? Who is he? How ought I to love him if I don't know? It's my fault. Either I'm stupid or a naughty boy, thought the child, and this was what caused his dubious, inquiring, sometimes hostile expression, and the shyness and uncertainty which Vronsky found so irksome. This child's presence always and infallibly called up in Vronsky that strange feeling of inexplicable loathing which he had experienced of late. This child's presence called up both in Vronsky and in Anna a feeling akin to the feeling of a sailor who sees by the compass that the direction in which he is swiftly moving is far from the right one, but that to arrest his motion is not in his power, that every instant is carrying him further and further away, and that to admit to himself his deviation from the right direction is the same as admitting his certain ruin. This child, with his innocent outlook upon life, was the compass that showed them the point to which they had departed from what they knew but did not want to know. This time Seryosha was not at home, and she was completely alone. She was sitting on the terrace waiting for the return of her son, who'd gone out for his walk and been caught in the rain. She had sent a manservant and a maid out to look for him, dressed in a white gown deeply embroidered. She was sitting in a corner of the terrace behind some flowers and did not hear him. Bending her curly black head, she pressed her forehead against a cool watering pot that stood on the parapet and both her lovely hands with the rings. He knew so well clasped the pot, the beauty of her whole figure, her head, her neck, her hands struck Vronsky every time as something new and unexpected. He stood still gazing at her in ecstasy, but directly he would have made a step to come nearer. To her, she was aware of his presence, pushed away the watering pot and turned her flushed face towards him. "What's the matter? Are you ill?" he said to her in French. Going up to her, he would have run to her, but remembering that there might be spectators, he looked round towards the balcony door and reddened a little, as he always reddened, feeling that he had to be afraid and be on his guard. "No, I'm quite well," she said, getting up and pressing his outstretched hand tightly. "I did not expect the mercy. What cold hands," he said. "You startled me," she said. "I'm alone and expecting Seryosha. He's out for a walk. They'll come in from this side." But in spite of her efforts to be calm, her lips were quivering. "Forgive me for coming, but I couldn't pass the day without seeing you," he went on, speaking French as he always did, to avoid using the stiff Russian plural form so impossibly frigid between them, and the dangerously intimate singular. "Forgive you. I'm so glad. But you're ill or worried," he went on, not letting go her hands and bending over her. "What were you thinking of?" "Always the same thing," she said with a smile. She spoke the truth. If ever at any moment she'd been asked what she was thinking of, she could have answered truly of the same thing, of her happiness and her unhappiness. She was thinking just when he came upon her of this. Why was it, she wondered, that to others, to Betsy, she knew of her secret connection with Tushkovich? It was all easy, while to her it was such torture today. This thought gained special poignancy from certain other considerations. She asked him about the races. He answered her questions, and seeing that she was agitated, trying to calm her, he began telling her in the simplest tones the details of his preparations for the races. Tell him or not tell him, she thought, looking into his quiet, affectionate eyes. He's so happy, so absorbed in his races, that he won't understand as he ought. He won't understand all the gravity of this fact to us. But you haven't told me what you were thinking of when I came in, he said, interrupting his narrative. Please tell me. She did not answer, and bending her head a little, she looked inquiringly at him from under her brows, her eyes shining under their long lashes. Her hand shook as it played with a leaf she'd picked up. He saw it, and his face expressed that utter subjection, that slavish devotion, which had done so much to win her. "I see something has happened. Do you suppose I can be at peace knowing you have a trouble I'm not sharing? Tell me, for God's sake," he repeated imploringly. "Yes, I shan't be able to forgive him if he does not realize all the gravity of it. Better not tell. Why put him to the proof?" she thought, still staring at him in the same way, and feeling the hand that held the leaf was trembling more and more. "For God's sake," he repeated, taking her hand. "Shall I tell you?" "Yes, yes, yes, I'm with child," she said softly and deliberately. The leaf in her hand shook more violently, but she did not take her eyes off him, watching how he would take it. He turned white, would have said something, but stopped. He dropped her hand, and his head sank on his breast. "Yes, he realizes all the gravity of it," she thought, and gratefully she pressed his hand, but she was mistaken in thinking he realized the gravity of the fact, as she, a woman, realized it. On hearing it, he felt come upon him with tenfold intensity that strange feeling of loathing of someone, but at the same time he felt that the turning point he'd been longing for had come now, that it was impossible to go on concealing things from her husband, and it was inevitable in one way or another that they should soon put an end to their unnatural position. But besides that, her emotion physically affected him in the same way. He looked at her with a look of submissive tenderness, kissed her hand, got up, and in silence paced up and down the terrace. "Yes," he said, going up to her resolutely, "neither you nor I have looked on our relations as a passing amusement, and now our fate is sealed. It is absolutely necessary to put an end." He looked round as he spoke, "to the deception in which we are living. Put an end." "How put an end, Alexei?" she said softly. She was calmer now, and her face lighted up with a tender smile. "Leave your husband and make our life one. It is one as it is," she answered scarcely audibly. "Yes, but altogether, altogether." "But how, Alexei? Tell me how," she said in melancholy mockery of the hopelessness of her own position. "Is there any way out of such a position? Am I not the wife of my husband? There is a way out of every position. We must take our line," he said. "Anything's better than the position in which you're living. Of course I see how you torture yourself over everything, the world And your son and your husband, oh, not over my husband, she said with a quiet smile. I don't know him, I don't think of him, he doesn't exist, you're not speaking sincerely, I know you worry about him too, oh, he doesn't. Even no, she said, and suddenly a hot flush came over her face, her cheeks, her brow, her neck crimsoned, and tears of shame came into her eyes. But we won't talk of him. Chapter 23. Fransky had several times already, though not so resolutely as now, tried to bring her to consider their position, and every time he'd been confronted by the same superficiality and triviality with which she met his appeal. Now it was as though there was something in this which she could not or would not face, as though directly she began to speak of this, she, the real Anna, retreated somehow into herself, and another strange and unaccountable woman came out whom he did not love, and whom he feared, and who was in opposition to him. But today he was resolved to have it out whether he knows or not, said Vronsky in his usual quiet and resolute tone. That's nothing to do with us. You cannot stay like this, especially now. What's to be done according to you? She asked with the same frivolous irony. She who had so feared he would take her condition too lightly was now vexed with him for deducing from it the necessity of taking some step. Tell him everything and leave him. Very well, let us suppose I do that, she said. Do you know what the result of that would be? I can tell you it all beforehand. And a wicked light gleamed in her eyes that had been so soft a minute before. Hey, you love another man and have entered into criminal intrigues with him, mimicking her husband. She threw an emphasis on the word criminal. As Alexei Alexandrovich, did I warn you of the results in the religious, the civil, and the domestic relation? You have not listened to me. Now I cannot let you disgrace my name and my son, she had meant to say, but about her son she could not just disgrace my name. And in more in the same style she added, in general terms, he'll say in his official manner and with all distinctness and precision that he cannot let me go, but will take all measures in his power to prevent scandal, and he will calmly and punctually act in accordance with his words. That's what will happen. He's not a man, but a machine, and a spiteful machine. When he's angry, she added, recalling Alexei Alexandrovich as she spoke with all the peculiarities of his figure and manner of speaking, and reckoning against him every defect she could find in him, softening nothing for the great wrong she herself was doing him. But Anna, said Vronsky in a soft and persuasive voice, trying to soothe her, we absolutely must anyway tell him, and then be guided by the line he takes. What, run away? And why not run away? I don't see how we can keep on like this, and not for my sake. I see that you suffer. Yes, run away and become your mistress, she said. Angrily, Anna, he said with reproachful tenderness. Yes, she went on, become your mistress and complete the ruin of, again she would have said, my son, but she could not utter that word. Vronsky could not understand how she, with her strong and truthful nature, could endure this state of deceit and not long to get out of it. But he did not suspect that the chief cause of it was the word son, which she could not bring herself to pronounce when she thought of her son and his future attitude to his mother, who had abandoned his father. She felt such terror at what she had done that she could not face it, but like a woman could only try to comfort herself with lying assurances that everything would remain as it always had been, and that it was possible to forget the fearful question of how it would be with her son. I beg you, I entreat you, she said, suddenly taking his hand and speaking in quite a different tone, sincere and tender. Never speak to me of that, but Anna, never leave it to me. I know all the baseness, all the horror of my position, but it's not so easy to arrange as you think, and leave it to me, and do what I say. Never speak to me of it. Do you promise me? No, promise. I promise everything, but I can't be at peace, especially after what you've told me. I can't be at peace when you can't be at peace. She repeated. Yes, I am worried sometimes, but that will pass if you will never talk about this. When you talk about it, it's only then it worries me. I don't understand, he said. I know, she interrupted him, how hard it is for your truthful nature to lie, and I grieve for you. I often think that you've ruined your whole life for me. I was just thinking the very same thing, he said. How could you sacrifice everything for my sake? I can't forgive myself that you're unhappy. Unhappy, she said, coming closer to him and looking at him with an ecstatic smile of love. I'm like a hungry man who's been given food. He may be cold and dressed in rags and ashamed, but he's not unhappy. Unhappy? No, this is my unhappiness. She could hear the sound of her son's voice coming towards them, and glancing swiftly round the terrace, she got up impulsively. Her eyes glowed with the fire he knew so well. With a rapid movement she raised her lovely hands covered with rings, took his head, looked a long look into his face, and putting up her face with smiling parted lips, swiftly kissed his mouth and both eyes and pushed him away. She would have gone, but he held her back when he murmured in a whisper, gazing in ecstasy at her. "Tonight, 1 o'clock, she whispered, and with a heavy sigh, she walked with her light, swift step to meet her son. Siryosha had been caught by the rain in the big garden, and he and his nurse had taken shelter in an arbor well. "Orvovo," she said to Vronsky, "I must soon be getting ready for the races. Betsy promised to fetch me." Vronsky, looking at his watch, went away hurriedly. Chapter 20. For when Vronsky looked at his watch on the Karenin's balcony, he was so greatly agitated and lost in his thoughts that he saw the figures on the watch's face, but could not take in what time it was. He came out on the high road and walked, picking his way carefully through the mud to his carriage. He was so completely absorbed in his feeling for Anna that he did not even think what o'clock it was, and whether he had time to go to Brian's. He had left him, as often happens. Only the external faculty of memory that points out each step one has to take one after the other. He went up to his coachman, who was dozing on the box in the shadow, already lengthening, of a thick lime tree. He admired the shifting clouds of midges circling over the hot horses, and waking the coachman, he jumped into the carriage and told him to drive to Brian's. It was only after driving nearly 5 miles that he had sufficiently recovered himself to look at his watch and realize that it was 5:30, and he was late. There were several races fixed for that day: the mounted guards race, then the officers' mile-and-a-half race, then the 3-mile race, and then the race for which he was entered. He could still be in time for his race, but if he went to Brioni's, he could only just be in time, and he would arrive when the whole of the court would be in their places. That would be a pity, but he'd promised Brioni to come, and so he decided to drive on, telling the coachman not to spare the horses. He reached Brioni's, spent 5 minutes there, and galloped back. This rapid drive calmed him. All that was painful in his relations with Anna, all the feelings of indefiniteness left by their conversation, had slipped out of his mind. He was thinking now with pleasure and excitement of the race, of his being anyhow in time, and now. And then the thought of the blissful interview awaiting him that night flashed across his imagination like a flaming light. The excitement of the approaching race gained upon him as he drove further and further into the atmosphere of the races, overtaking carriages driving up from the summer villas or out of Petersburg. At his quarters no one was left at home. All were at the races, and his valet was looking out for him at the gate while he was changing his clothes. His valet told him that the second race had begun already, that a lot of gentlemen had been to ask for him, and a boy had twice run up from the stables dressing without hurry. He never hurried himself and never lost his self-possession. Vronsky drove to the sheds. From the sheds he could see a perfect sea of carriages and people on foot, soldiers surrounding the race course and pavilion swarming with people. The second race was apparently going on, for just as he went into the sheds he heard a bell ringing. Going towards the stable he met the white-legged chestnut Mahoutin's gladiator, being led to the race course in a blue forage horsecloth with what looked like huge ears edged with blue. "Where's Court?" he asked the stable boy in the stable. Putting on the saddle in the open horse box stood Frou-Frou, saddled ready. They were just going to lead her out. "I'm not too late." All right, said the Englishman. "Don't upset yourself." Vronsky once more took in one glance the exquisite lines of his favorite Mare, who was quivering all over, and with an effort he tore himself from the sight of her and went out of the stable. He went towards the pavilions at the most favorable moment for escaping attention. The mile-and-a-half race was just finishing, and all eyes were fixed on the horse guard in front and the light huiser behind, urging their horses on with a last effort close to the winning post from the center. And outside of the ring all were crowding to the winning post, and a group of soldiers and officers of the horse guards were shouting loudly their delight at the expected triumph of their officer, and Comrade Vronsky moved into the middle of the crowd unnoticed almost at the very moment when the bell rang at the finish of the race, and the tall mud-spattered horse guard who came in first, bending over the saddle, let go the reins of his panting gray horse that looked dark with sweat. The horse, stiffening out its legs with an effort, stopped its rapid course, and the officer of the horse guards looked round him like a man waking up from a heavy sleep and just managed to smile. A crowd of friends and outsiders pressed round him. Vronsky intentionally avoided that select crowd of the upper world, which was moving and talking with discreet freedom before the pavilions. He knew that Madame Karenina was there, and Betsy, and his brother's wife, and he purposely did not go near them for fear of something distracting his attention. But he was continually met and stopped by acquaintances who told him about the previous races and kept asking him why he was so late at the time when the racers had to go to the pavilion to receive the prizes, and all attention was directed to that point. Vronsky's elder brother, Alexander, a colonel with heavy fringed epaulets, came up to him. He was not tall, though as broadly built as Alexei, and handsomer and rosier than he. Had a red nose and an open, drunken-looking face. "Did you get my note?" he said. "There's never any finding you, Alexander." Vronsky, in spite of the dissolute life, and in especial the drunken habits for which he was notorious, was quite one of the court circle now, as he talked to his brother of a matter bound to be exceedingly disagreeable to him. Knowing that the eyes of many people might be fixed upon him, he kept a smiling countenance, as though he were jesting with his brother about something of little moment. "I got it, and I really can't make out what you are worrying yourself about," said Alexei. "I'm worrying myself because the remark has just been made to me that you weren't here, and that you were seen in Petersburg on Monday. There are matters which only concern those directly interested in them, and the matter you are so worried about is yes, but if so, you may as well cut the service. I beg you not to meddle. And that's all I have to say." Alexei Vronsky's frowning face turned white, and his prominent lower jaw quivered, which happened rarely with him, being a man of very warm heart. He was seldom angry, but when he was angry, and when his chin quivered, then, as Alexander Vronsky knew, he was dangerous. Alexander Vronsky smiled gaily. "I only wanted to give you mother's letter. Answer it, and don't worry about anything. Just before the race, Bonchance," he added, smiling, and he moved away from him. But after him another friendly greeting brought Vronsky to a standstill. "So you won't recognize your friend? How are you, monsieur?" said Stepan Arkadyevitch, as conscientiously brilliant in the midst of all the Petersburg brilliance as he was in Moscow, his face rosy and his whiskers sleek and glossy. "I came up yesterday, and I'm delighted that I shall see your triumph. When should we meet?" "Come tomorrow to the mess room," said Vronsky, and squeezing him by the sleeve of his coat with apologies, he moved away to the center of the racecourse, where the horses were being led for the great steeplechase. The horses who had run in the last race were being led home, steaming and exhausted by the stable boys, and one after another the fresh horses for the coming race made their appearance, for the most part English racers wearing horsecloths and looking with their drawn-up bellies like strange huge birds. On the right was led and frou-frou, lean and beautiful, lifting up her elastic, rather long pastures as though moved by springs. Not far from her they were taking the rug off the lop-eared Gladiator, the strong, exquisite, perfectly correct lines of the stallion, with his superb hind quarters and excessively short pasterns almost over his hoofs, attracted Vronsky's attention. In spite of himself he would have gone up to his mare, but he was again detained by an acquaintance. "Oh, there's Karenin," said the acquaintance with whom he was chatting. "He's looking for his wife, and she's in the middle of the pavilion. Didn't you see her?" "No," answered Vronsky, and without even glancing round towards the pavilion where his friend was pointing out Madame Karenina, he went up to his mare. Vronsky had not had time to look at the saddle, about which he had to give some direction, when the competitors were summoned to the pavilion to receive their numbers and places in the row at starting. 17 officers, looking serious and severe, many with pale faces, met together in the pavilion and drew the numbers. Vronsky drew the number 7. A cry was heard. Mount, feeling that with the others riding in the race, he was the center upon which all eyes were fastened, Vronsky walked up to his mare in that state of nervous tension in which he usually became deliberate and composed in his movements. Cord, in honor of the races, had put on his best clothes, a black coat, buttoned up a stiffly starched collar, which propped up his cheeks, a round black hat, and top boots. He was calm and dignified as ever, and was with his own hands holding Frou-Frou by both reins, standing straight in front of her. Frou-Frou was still trembling as though in a fever, her eye full of fire glanced sideways at Vronsky. Vronsky slipped his finger under the saddle girth. The mare glanced to the slant at him, drew up her lip and twitched her ear. The Englishman puckered up his lips, intending to indicate a smile that anyone should. Verify his saddling. Get up, you won't feel so excited. Francie looked around for the last time at his rivals. He knew that he would not see them during the race. Two were already riding forward to the point from which they were to start. Goltson, a friend of Vronsky's and one of his more formidable rivals, was moving around a bay horse that would not let him mount. A light little Azar in tight riding breeches rode off at a gallop, crouched up like a cat on the saddle, an imitation of English jockeys. Prince Kazavlev sat with a white face on his thoroughbred Mari from the Grabovsky stud, while an English groom led her by the bridle. Vronsky and all his comrades knew Kazavlev and his peculiarity of weak nerves and terrible vanity. They knew that he was afraid of everything, afraid of riding a spirited horse. But now, just because it was terrible, because people broke their necks, and there was a doctor standing at each obstacle, and an ambulance with a cross on it, and a sister of mercy, he had made up his mind to take part in the race. Their eyes met, and Vronsky gave him a friendly and encouraging nod. Only one. He did not see his chief rival Madden on Gladiator. Don't be in a hurry, said Cord to Vronsky, and remember one thing. Don't hold her in at the fences, and don't urge her on. Let her go as she likes. All right, said Vronsky, taking the reins. If you can lead the race, but don't lose heart till the last minute, even if you're behind before the Mari had time to move. Vronsky stepped with an agile, vigorous movement into the steel-toothed stirrup and lightly and firmly seated himself on the creaking leather of the saddle. Getting his right foot in the stirrup, he smoothed the double reins, as he always did, between his fingers, and Cord let go, as though she did not know which foot to put first. Frou-Frou started dragging at the reins with her long neck, and as though she were on springs, shaking her rider from side to side. Cord quickened his step, following him, the excited Mari trying to shake off her rider first on one side, and then the other pulled at the reins, and Vronsky tried in vain, with voice and hand, to soothe her. They were just reaching the dammed upstream on their way to the starting point. Several of the riders were in front and several behind, when suddenly Vronsky heard the sound of a horse galloping in the mud behind him, and he was overtaken by Maherton on his white leg. Lop-eared Gladiator. Maherton smiled, showing his long teeth, but Vronsky looked angrily at him. He did not like him and regarded him now as his most formidable rival. He was angry with him for galloping past and exciting his Mari. Frou-Frou started into a gallop, her left foot forward, made to bounds and fretting at the tightened reins, passed into a jolting trot, bumping her rider up and down. Cord scowled and followed Vronsky almost at a trot. Chapter 25. There were 17 officers in all riding in this race. The race course was a large 3-mile ring in the form of an ellipse in front of the pavilion. On this course 9 obstacles had been arranged. The stream, a big and solid barrier 5 feet high just before the pavilion, a dry ditch, a ditch full of water, a precipitous slope, an Irish barricade. One of the most difficult obstacles, consisting of a mound fence with brushwood beyond, which was a ditch out of sight for the horses, so that the horse had to clear both obstacles or might be killed. Then 2 more ditches filled with water and one dry one, and the end of the race was just facing the pavilion. But the race began not in the ring, but 200 yards away from it, and in that part of the course was the first obstacle, a dammed upstream 7 feet in breadth, which the racers could leap or wade through as they preferred. 3 times they were ranged ready to start, but each time some horse thrust itself out of line, and they had to begin again. The umpire who was starting them, Colonel Sestrin, was beginning to lose his temper. When at last, for the 4th time, he shouted away, and the racers started. Every opera glass was turned on the brightly colored group of riders at the moment they were in line to start. Their starting was heard on all sides. After the hush of expectation, and the little groups and solitary figures among the public began running from place to place to get a better view, in the very first minute the close group of horsemen drew out, then it could be seen that they were approaching the stream in 2s and 3s, and one behind another. To the spectators it seemed as though they had all started simultaneously, but to the racers there were seconds of difference that had great value to them. Frou-Frou, excited and over nervous, had lost the first moment, and several horses had started before her. But before reaching the stream, Vronsky, who was holding in the Mare with all of his force as she tugged at the bridle, easily overtook 3, and there were left in front of him Madden's chestnut Gladiator, whose hindquarters were moving lightly and rhythmically up and down exactly in front of Vronsky, and in front of all the dainty Mare Diana bearing Kozlovlev more dead than alive. For the first instant Vronsky was not master either of himself or his Mare, but up to the first obstacle, the stream, he could not guide the motions of his Mare gladiator, and Diana came up to it together, and almost at the same instant simultaneously they rose above the stream and flew across to the other side. Frou-Frou darted after them as if flying. But at the very moment when Vronsky felt himself in the air, he suddenly saw under his Mare's hoofs Kozlovlev, who was floundering with Diana on the other side of the stream. Kozlovlev had let go the reins as he took the leap, and the Mare had sent him flying over her head. Those details Vronsky learned later. At the moment all he saw was that just under him where Frou-Frou must alight, Diana's legs or head might be in the way, but Frou-Frou drew up her legs and back in the very act of leaping like a falling cat and clearing the other Mare alighted beyond her. Oh, the darling, thought Vronsky. After crossing the stream, Vronsky had complete control of his Mare and began holding her, intending to cross the great barrier behind Matin and to try to overtake him in the clear ground of about 500 yards that followed. At the great barrier stood just in front of the imperial pavilion the Tsar and the whole court, and crowds of people were all gazing at him, and Matin a length ahead of him. As they drew near the devil, as the solid barrier was called, Vronsky was aware of those eyes fastened upon him from all sides, but he saw nothing except the ears and neck of his own Mare, the ground racing to meet him, and the back and white legs of Gladiator beating time swiftly before him and keeping always the same distance ahead. Gladiator rose with no sound of knocking against anything. With a wave of his short tail he disappeared from Vronsky's sight. Bravo, cried a voice. At the same instant, under Vronsky's eyes right before him flashed the palings of the barrier. Without the slightest change in her action, his Mare flew over it. The palings vanished, and he only heard a crash behind him. The Mare, excited by Gladiator's keeping ahead, had risen too soon before the barrier and grazed it with her hind hoofs. But her pace never changed, and Vronsky, feeling a spatter of mud in his face, realized that he was once more the same distance from Gladiator. Once more he perceived in front of him the same back and short tail, and again the same swiftly moving white legs that got no further away. At the very moment when Vronsky thought that now was the time to overtake Mahoutzen, Frou-Frou herself, understanding his thoughts without any incitement on his part, gained ground considerably and began getting alongside of Mahoutzen on the most favorable side, close to the inner cord. Mahoutzen would not let her pass that side. Vronsky had hardly formed the thought that he could perhaps pass on the outer side when Frou-Frou shifted her pace and began overtaking him on the other side. Frou-Frou's shoulder, beginning by now to be dark with sweat, was even with Gladiator's back. For a few lengths they moved evenly, but before the obstacle they were approaching, Vronsky began working at the reins, anxious to avoid having to take the outer circle, and swiftly passed Mahoutzen just upon the declivity. He caught a glimpse of his mud-stained face as he flashed by. He even fancied that he smiled. Vronsky passed Mahoutzen, and he was immediately aware of him close upon him, and he never ceased hearing the even thudded hoofs and the rapid and still quite fresh breathing of Gladiator. The next two obstacles, the water course and the barrier, were easily crossed, but Vronsky began to hear the snorting and thud of Gladiator closer upon him. He urged on his Mare, and to his delight felt that she easily quickened her pace, and the thud of Gladiator's hoofs was again heard at the same distance away. Vronsky was at the head of the race, just as he wanted to be, and his cord had advised, and now he felt sure of being the winner. His excitement, his delight, and his tenderness for Frou-Frou grew keener and keener. He longed to look around again, but he did not dare do this, and tried to be cool and not to urge on his Mare, so to keep the same reserve of force in her as he felt the Gladiator still kept. There remained only one obstacle, the most difficult. If he could cross it ahead of the others he would come in first. He was flying towards the Irish barricade. Frou-Frou and he both together saw the barricade in the distance, and both the man and the Mare had a moment's hesitation. He saw the uncertainty in the mayor's ears and lifted the whip, but at the same time he felt that his fears were groundless. The mayor knew what was wanted. She quickened her pace and rose smoothly, just as he had fancied she would, and as she left the ground gave herself up to the force of her rush, which carried her far beyond the ditch, and with the same rhythm, without effort, with the same leg forward, Frou-Frou fell back into her pace again. Bravo, Vronsky. He heard shouts from a knot of men. He knew they were his friends in the regiment, who were standing at the obstacle. He could not fail to recognize Yasvin's voice, though he did not see him. "Oh, my sweet," he said inwardly to Frou-Frou as he listened for what was happening behind. He's cleared it, he thought, catching the thud of gladiators' hoofs behind. There remained only the last ditch filled with water and 5 feet wide. Vronsky did not even look at it, but anxious to get in a long way first, began sawing away at the rails, lifting the Mare's head and letting it go in time with her paces. He felt that the Mare was at her very last reserve of strength. Not her neck and shoulders merely were wet, but the sweat was standing in drops on her mane. Her head, her sharp ears, and her breath came in short, sharp gasps, but he knew that she had strength left, more than enough for the remaining 500 yards. It was only from feeling himself nearer the ground and from the peculiar smoothness of his motion that Vronsky knew how greatly the Mare had quickened her pace. She flew over the ditch, as though not noticing it. She flew over it like a bird, but at the same instant Vronsky, to his horror, felt that he had failed to keep up with the Mare's pace. That he did not know how, made a fearful, unpardonable mistake in recovering his seat in the saddle. All at once his position had shifted, and he knew that something awful had happened. He could not yet make out what had happened when the white legs of a chestnut horse flashed by close to him, and Mahutin passed at a swift gallop. Vronsky was touching the ground with one foot, and as Mare was sinking on that foot, he just had time to free his leg when she fell on one side, gasping painfully and making vain efforts to rise. With her delicate silking neck she fluttered on the ground at his feet like a shot bird. The clumsy movement made by Vronsky had broken her back, but that he only knew much later. At that moment he knew only that Mahutin had flown swiftly by, while he stood staggering alone on the muddy, motionless ground, and Frou-Frou lay gasping before him, bending her head back and gazing at him with her exquisite eyes, still unable to realize what had happened. Vronsky tugged at his Mare's reins again. She struggled all over like a fish, and her shoulders setting the saddle heaving, she rose on her front legs, but unable to lift her back. She quivered all over and again fell on her side with a face hideous with passion, his lower jaw trembling, and his cheeks white. Franz kicked her with his heel in the stomach and again fell to tugging at the rein. She did not stir, but thrusting her nose into the ground, she simply gazed at her master with her speaking eyes. "Ah," groaned Vronsky, clutching his head. "Oh, what have I done?" he cried. "The race lost, and my fault shameful, unpardonable, and the poor darling ruined Mare. Oh, what have I done?" A crowd of men, a doctor and his assistant, the officers of his regiment, ran up to him. To his misery he felt that he was whole and unhurt. The Mare had broken her back, and it was decided to shoot her. Vronsky could not answer questions, could not speak to anyone. He turned, and without picking up his cap that had fallen off, walked away from the race course, not knowing where he was going. He felt utterly wretched. For the first time in his life he knew the bitterest sort of misfortune beyond remedy, and caused by his own fault. Yasvin overtook him with his cap and led him home, and half an hour later Vronsky had regained his self-possession. But the memory of that race remained for long in his heart, the cruelest and bitterest memory of his life. Chapter 26. The external relations of Alexei Alexandrovich and his wife had remained unchanged. The sole difference lay in the fact that he was more busily occupied than ever. As in former years, at the beginning of the spring he had gone to a foreign watering place for the sake of his health, deranged by the winter's work that every year grew heavier, and just as always he returned in July, and at once fell to work as usual with increased energy. As usual too, his wife had moved for the summer to a villa out of town, while he remained in Petersburg. From the date of their conversation after the party at Princess Verskaya's, he had never spoken again to Anna of his suspicions and his jealousies, and that habitual tone of his bantering mimicry was the most convenient tone possible for his present attitude to his wife. He was a little colder to his wife. He simply seemed to be slightly displeased with her for that first midnight conversation, which she had repelled. In his attitude to her there was a shade of vexation. "But nothing more. You would not be open with me," he seemed to say, mentally addressing her. "So much the worse for you. Now you may beg as you please, "But I won't be open with you, so much the worse for you," he said mentally, like a man who, after vainly attempting to extinguish a fire, should fly in a rage with his vain efforts, and say, "Oh, very well, then you shall burn for this." This man, so subtle and astute in official life, did not realize all the senselessness of such an attitude to his wife. He did not realize it because it was too terrible to him to realize his actual position, and he shut down and locked and sealed up in his heart that secret place where lay hid his feelings toward his family, that is his wife and son. He who had been such a careful father had from the end of that winter become peculiarly frigid to his son and adopted to him just the same bantering tone he used with his wife. "Bah, young man," was the greeting with which he met him, Alexei Alexandrovich asserted, and believed that he had never in any previous year had so much official business as that year. But he was not aware that he sought work for himself that year, that this was one of the means for keeping shut that secret place where lay hid his feelings towards his wife and son, and his thoughts about them, which became more terrible the longer they lay there. If anyone had had the right to ask Alexei Alexandrovich what he thought of his wife's behavior, the mild and peaceable Alexei Alexandrovich would have made no answer, but he would have been greatly angered with any man who should question him on that subject. For this reason, there positively came into Alexei Alexandrovich's face a look of haughtiness and severity whenever anyone inquired after his wife's health. Alexei Alexandrovich did not want to think at all about his wife's behavior, and he actually succeeded in not thinking about it at all. Alexei Alexandrovich's permanent summer villa was in Petersburg, and the Countess Lydia Ivanovna used as a rule to spend the summer there close to Anna, and constantly seeing her that year, Countess Lydia Ivanovna declined to settle in Peterhof, was not once at Anna Arkadyevna's, and in conversation with Alexei Alexandrovich, hinted at the unsuitability of Anna's close intimacy with Betsy and Vronsky. Alexei Alexandrovich sternly cut her short, roundly declaring his wife to be above suspicion, and from that time began to avoid Countess Lydia Ivanovna. He did not want to see, and did not see, that many people in society cast dubious glances on his wife. He did not want to understand, and did not understand why his wife had so particularly insisted on staying at Sargsko, where Betsy was staying, and not far from the camp of Vronsky's regiment. He did not allow himself to think about it, and he did not think about it, but all the same, though he never admitted it to himself, and had no proofs, not even suspicious evidence, in the bottom of his heart, he knew beyond all doubt that he was a deceived husband, that he was profoundly miserable about it. How often during those 8 years of happy life with his wife, Alexei Alexandrovich had looked at other men's faithless wives and other deceived husbands and asked himself, how can people descend to that? How is it they don't put an end to such a hideous position? But now, when the misfortune had come upon himself, he was so far from thinking of putting an end to the position that he would not recognize it at all, would not recognize it just because it was too awful, too unnatural. Since his return from abroad, Alexei Alexandrovich had twice been at their country villa. Once he dined there, another time he spent the evening there with a party of friends, but he had not once stayed the night there, as it had been his habit to do in previous years. The day of the races had been a very busy day for Alexei Alexandrovich, but when mentally sketching out the day in the morning, he made up his mind to go to their country house to see his wife immediately after dinner, and from there to the races, which all the court were to witness, and at which he was bound to be present. He was going to see his wife because he had determined to see her once a week to keep up appearances, and besides, on that day, as it was the 15th, he had to give his wife some money for her expenses according to their usual agreement, with his habitual control over his thoughts. Though he thought all this about his wife, he did not let his thoughts stray further in regard to her. That morning was a very full one for Alexei Alexandrovich. The evening before, Countess Lydia Ivanovna had sent him a pamphlet by a celebrated traveler in China who was staying in Petersburg, and with it she enclosed a note begging him to see the traveler himself, as he was an extremely interesting person from various points of view and likely to be useful. Alexei Alexandrovich had not had time to read the pamphlet through in the evening and finished it in the morning. Then people began arriving with petitions, and there came the reports, interviews, appointments, dismissals, apportionment of rewards, pensions, grants, notes, the workaday round, as Alexei Alexandrovich called it, that took up so much time Then there was private business of his own, a visit from the doctor, and the steward who managed his property. The steward did not take up much time. He simply gave Alexei Alexandrovich the money he needed together, with a brief statement of the position of his affairs, which was not altogether satisfactory, as it had happened that during that year, owing to increased expenses, more had been paid out than usual, and there was a deficit. But the doctor, a celebrated Petersburg doctor who was an intimate acquaintance of Alexei Alexandrovich, took up a great deal of time. Alexei Alexandrovich had not expected him that day, and was surprised at his visit, and still more so when the doctor questioned him carefully about his health, listened to his breathing, and tapped at his liver. Alexei Alexandrovich did not know that his friend Lydia Ivanovna, noticing that he was not as well as usual that year, had begged the doctor to go and examine him. "Do this for my sake," the Countess Lydia Ivanovna had said to him. "I will do it for the sake of Russia, Countess," replied the doctor, a priceless man, said the Countess Lydia Ivanovna. The doctor was extremely dissatisfied with Alexei Alexandrovich. He found the liver considerably enlarged and the digestive powers weakened. While the course of mineral waters had been quite without effect, he prescribed more physical exercise as far as possible, and as far as possible less mental strain, and above all no worry. In other words, just what was as much out of Alexei Alexandrovich's power as abstaining from breathing. Then he withdrew, leaving in Alexei Alexandrovich an unpleasant sense that something was wrong with him, and that there was no chance of curing it. As he was coming away, the doctor chanced to meet on the staircase an acquaintance of his, Sludin, who was secretary of Alexei Alexandrovich's department. They had been comrades at the university, and though they rarely met, they thought highly of each other and were excellent friends. And so there was no one to whom the doctor would have given his opinion of a patient so freely as to Sludin. "How glad I am you've been seeing him," said Sludin. "He's not well, and I fancy well. What do you think of him, I tell you," said the doctor, beckoning over Slumber's head to his coachman to bring the carriage around. "It's just this," said the doctor, taking a finger of his kid glove in his white hands and pulling it. "If you don't strain the strings and then try to break them, you'll find it a difficult job. But strain a string to its very utmost, and the mere weight of one finger on the strained string will snap it." And with his close assiduity, his conscientious devotion to his work, he's strained to the utmost, and there's some outside burden weighing on him, and not a light one, concluded the doctor, raising his eyebrows significantly. "Will you be at the races?" he added, as he sank into his seat in the carriage. "Yes, yes, to be sure. Does waste a lot of time," the doctor responded vaguely to some reply of Sludin's. He had not caught directly after the doctor, who had taken up so much time, came the celebrated traveler, and Alexei Alexandrovich, by means of the pamphlet he had only just finished reading, and his previous acquaintance with the subject, impressed the traveler by the depths of his knowledge of the subject and the breadth and enlightenment of his view of it. At the same time as the traveler, there was announced a provincial marshal of nobility on a visit to Petersburg, with whom Alexei Alexandrovich had to have some conversation. After his departure, he had to finish the daily routine of business with his secretary, and then he still had to drive round to call on a certain great personage on a matter of grave and serious import. Alexei Alexandrovich only just managed to be back by 5 o'clock, his dinner hour, and after dining with his secretary, he invited him to drive with him to his country villa and to the races. Though he did not acknowledge it to himself, Alexei Alexandrovich always tried nowadays to secure the presence of a third person in his interviews with his wife. Chapter 27. Anna was upstairs, standing before the looking glass, and with Anushka's assistance pinning the last ribbon on her gown, when she heard carriage wheels crunching the gravel at the entrance. "It's too early for Betsy," she thought, and glancing out of the window she caught sight of the carriage and the black hat of Alexei Alexandrovich, and the ears that she knew so well sticking up each side of it. How unlucky can he be going to stay the night, she wondered, and the thought of all that might come of such a chance struck her so awful and terrible that without dwelling on it for a moment, she went down to meet him with a bright and radiant face, and conscious of the presence of that spirit of falsehood and deceit in herself that she'd come to know of late, she abandoned herself to that spirit and began talking hardly Knowing what she was saying, "Ah, how nice of you," she said, giving her husband her hand and greeting Sleaton, who was like one of the family. With a smile, "You're staying the night, I hope," was the first word the spirit of falsehood prompted her to utter. "And now we'll go together, only it's a pity. I promised Betsy she's coming for me." Alexei Alexandrovich knit his brows at Betsy's name. "I'm not going to separate the inseparables," he said in his usual bantering tone. "I'm going with Mikhail Vasilovich. I'm ordered exercise by the doctors to I'll walk and fancy myself at the springs again." "There's no hurry," said Anna. "Would you like tea?" She rang, "Bring in tea. And tell Seryosha that Alexei Alexandrovich is here." "Well, tell me, how have you been?" "Mikhail Vasilyevich, you've not been to see me before. Look how lovely it is out in the terrace," she said, turning first to one and then to the other. She spoke very simply and naturally, but too much and too fast. She was the more aware of this from noticing in the inquisitive look Mikhail Vasilyevich turned on her that he was as it were keeping watch on her. Mikhail Vasilyevich promptly went out on the terrace. She sat down beside her husband. "You don't look quite well," she said. "Yes," he said, "the doctor's been with me today and wasted an hour of my time. I feel that some one of our friends must have sent him. My health's so precious, it seems." "No, what did he say?" She questioned him about his health and what he'd been doing and tried to persuade him to take a rest and come out to her. "All this," she said brightly, rapidly, and with a peculiar brilliance in her eyes. But Alexei Alexandrovich did not now attach any special significance to this tone of hers. He heard only her words and gave them only the direct sense they bore, and he answered simply, though jestingly. There was nothing remarkable in all this conversation, but never after could Anna recall this brief scene without an agonizing pang of shame. Seryosha came in, preceded by his governess. If Alexei Alexandrovich had allowed himself to observe, he would have noticed the timid and bewildered eyes with which Seryosha glanced first at his father and then at his mother, but he would not see anything, and he did not see it. "Ah, the young man, he's grown really. He's getting quite a man. How are you, young man?" And he gave his hand to the scared child. Sergei had been shy of his father before, and now ever since Alexei Alexandrovich had taken to calling him young man, and since that insoluble question had occurred to him whether Vronsky were a friend or a foe, he avoided his father. He looked round towards his mother as though seeking shelter. It was only with his mother that he was at ease. Meanwhile, Alexei Alexandrovich was holding his son by the shoulder while he was speaking to the governess, and Seryosha was so miserably uncomfortable that Anna saw he was on the point of tears. Anna, who had flushed a little the instant her son came in, noticing that Seryosha was uncomfortable, got up hurriedly, took Alexei Alexandrovich's hand from her son's shoulder, and kissing the boy, led him out onto the terrace and quickly came back. "It's time to start though," said she, glancing at her watch. "How is it?" "Betsy doesn't come." "Yes," said Alexei Alexandrovich, and getting up he folded his hands and cracked his fingers. "I've come to bring you some money for nightingales. We know can't live on fairy tales." He said, "You want it, I expect." "No, I don't." "Yes, I do," she said, not looking at him and crimsoning to the roots of her hair. "But you'll come back here after the races, I suppose?" "Oh yes," answered Alexei Alexandrovich, "and here's the glory of Peter off Princess Tverskaya," he added, looking out of the window at the elegant English carriage with the tiny seats placed extremely high. "What elegance, charming. Well, let us be starting to then." Princess Vershka did not get out of her carriage, but her groom in high boots, a cape and black hat darted out at the entrance. "I'm going." "Goodbye," said Anna, and kissing her son she went up to Alexei Alexandrovich and held out her hand to him. "It was ever so nice of you to come." Alexei Alexandrovich kissed her hand. "Well, au revoir. Then you'll come back for some tea?" "That's delightful," she said, and went out gay and radiant. But as soon as she no longer saw him, she was aware of the spot on her hand that his lips had touched, and she shuddered with repulsion. Chapter 28. When Alexei Alexandrovich reached the race course, Anna was already sitting in the pavilion beside Betsy. In that pavilion, where all the highest society had gathered, she caught sight of her husband in the distance. To men, her husband and her lover were the two centers of her existence, and unaided by her external senses, she was aware of their nearness. She was aware of her husband approaching a long way off, and she could not help following him in the surging crowd in the midst of which he was moving. She watched his progress towards the pavilion, saw him now responding condescendingly to an ingratiating bow, now exchanging friendly, nonchalant greetings with his equals, now assiduously trying to catch the eye of some great one of this world, and taking off his big round hat that squeezed the tips of his ears. All these ways of his she knew, and all were hateful to her. Nothing but ambition, nothing but the desire to get on. That's all there is in his soul, she thought, is for these lofty ideals, love of culture, religion. There are only so many tools for getting on. From his glances towards the ladies' pavilion, he was staring straight at her, but did not distinguish his wife in the sea of muslin, ribbons, feathers, parasols, and flowers. She saw that he was looking for her, but she purposely avoided noticing him. Alexei Alexandrovich, Princess Betsy called to him. I'm sure you don't see your wife here. She is. He smiled his chilly smile. There's so much splendor here that one's eyes are dazzled, he said, and he went into the pavilion. He smiled to his wife as a man should smile on meeting his wife, after only just parting from her, and greeted the princess and other acquaintances, giving to each what was due, that is to say, jesting with the ladies, and dealing out friendly greetings. Among the men below near the pavilion was standing an adjutant general of whom Alexei Alexandrovich had a high opinion, noted for his intelligence and culture. Alexei Alexandrovich entered into conversation with him. There was an interval between the races, and so nothing hindered conversation. The adjutant general expressed his disapproval of races. Alexei Alexandrovich replied, defending them. Anna heard his high measured tones, not losing one word, and every word struck her as false and stabbed her ears with pain. When the 3-mile steeplechase was beginning, she bent forward and gazed with fixed eyes at Vronsky as he went up to his horse and mounted, and at the same time she heard that loathsome, never-ceasing voice of her husband. She was in an agony of terror for Vronsky, but a still greater agony was the never-ceasing, as it seemed to her, stream of her husband's shrill voice with its familiar intonations. I'm a wicked woman, a lost woman, she thought, but I don't like lying. I can't endure falsehood. While as for him, her husband, it's the breath of his life. Falsehood, he knows all about it. He sees it all. What does he care if he can talk so calmly? If he were to kill me, if he were to kill Vronsky, I might respect him. No, all he wants is falsehood and propriety, Anna said to herself, not considering exactly what it was she wanted of her husband, and how she would have liked to see him behave. She did not understand either that Alexei Alexandrovich's peculiar loquacity that day, so exasperating to her, was merely the expression of his inward distress and uneasiness as a child that has been hurt skips about putting all of his muscles into movement to drown the pain in the same way. Alexei Alexandrovich needed mental exercise to drown the thoughts of his wife that in her presence and in Vronsky's, and with the continual iteration of his name, would force themselves on his attention, and it was as natural for him to talk well and cleverly as it is natural for a child to skip about. He was saying danger in the races of officers, of cavalry men, is an essential element in the race. If England can point to the most brilliant feats of cavalry in military history, it's simply owing to the fact that she has historically developed this force, both in beasts and in men's. Sport has, in my opinion, a great value. And as is always the case, we see nothing but what is most superficial. It's not superficial, said Princess Vierskaya. One of the officers, they say, has broken to ribs. Alexei Alexandrovich smiled his smile, which uncovered his teeth, but revealed nothing more. Will admit, Princess, that that's not superficial, he said, but internal. But that's not the point. And he turned again to the general, with whom he was talking seriously. We mustn't forget that those who are taking part in the race are military men who have chosen that career, and one must allow that every calling has its disagreeable side. It forms an integral part of the duties of an officer. Low sports, such as prize fighting or Spanish bullfights, are a sign of barbarity, but specialized trials of skill are a sign of development. No, I shan't come another time. It's too upsetting, said Princess Betsy. Isn't it, Anna? It is upsetting, but one can't tear oneself away, said another lady. If I'd been a Roman woman, I should never have missed a single circus. Anna said nothing, and keeping her opera glass up, gazed always at the same spot. At that moment, a tall general walked through the pavilion. Breaking off what he was saying, Alexei Alexandrovich got up hurriedly, though with dignity, and bowed low to the general. You're not racing? The officer asked, chaffing him. My race is a harder one, Alexei Alexandrovich responded deferentially, And though the answer meant nothing, the general looked as though he had heard a witty remark from a witty man and fully relished la power de la sauce. There are two aspects, Alexei Alexandrovich resumed. Those who take part and those who look on, and love for such spectacles is an unmistakable proof of a low degree of development in the spectator, I admit. But Princess Bets, sounded Stepan Karlovich's voice from below, addressing Betsy. Who's your favorite? Anna and I are for Kozlovlev, replied Betsy. I'm for Vronsky. A pair of gloves, done. But it is a pretty sight, isn't it? Alexei Alexandrovich paused while I was talking about him. But he began again directly. I admit that manly sports do not. He was continuing. But at that moment the racers started, and all conversation ceased. Alexei Alexandrovich too was silent, and everyone stood up and turned towards the stream. Alexei Alexandrovich took no interest in the race, and so he did not watch the racers but fell listlessly scanning the spectators. With his weary eyes, his eyes rested upon Anna. Her face was white, and said she was obviously seeing nothing and no one but one man. Her hand had convulsively clutched her fan, and she held her breath. He looked at her and hastily turned away, scrutinizing other faces. But here's this lady too, and others very much moved as well. It's very natural, Alexei Alexandrovich told himself. He tried not to look at her, but unconsciously his eyes were drawn to her. He examined that face again, trying not to read what was so plainly written on it, and against his own will with horror read on it what he did not want to know. The first fall Kozlovlevs at the stream agitated everyone but Alexei Alexandrovich saw distinctly on Anna's pale, triumphant face that the man she was watching had not fallen. When after Madden and Vronsky had cleared the worst barrier, the next officer had been thrown straight on his head at it and fatally injured. And a shudder of horror passed over the whole public. Alexei Alexandrovich saw that Anna did not even notice it and had some difficulty in realizing what they were talking of about her, but more and more often, and with greater persistence, he watched her. Anna, wholly engrossed as she was with the race, became aware of her husband's cold eyes fixed upon her from one side. She glanced round for an instant, looking inquiringly at him, and with a slight frown turned away again. Oh, I don't care, she seemed to say to him, and she did not once glance at him again. The race was an unlucky one, and of the 17 officers who rode in it, more than half were thrown and hurt. Towards the end of the race, everyone was in a state of agitation, which was intensified by the fact that the Tsar was displeased. Chapter 29. Everyone was loudly expressing disapprobation. Everyone was repeating a phrase someone had uttered: the lions and the gladiators will be the next thing, and everyone was feeling horrified, so that when Vronsky fell to the ground and Anna moaned aloud, there was nothing very out of the way in it. But afterwards a change came over Anna's face, which really was beyond decorum. She utterly lost her head. She began fluttering like a caged bird. At one moment she would have got up and moved away, at the next turned to Betsy. Let us go, she said. But Betsy did not hear her. She was bending down talking to a general who'd come up to her. Alexei Alexandrovich went up to Anna and courteously offered her his arm. Let us go, if you like, he said in French. But Anna was listening to the general and did not notice her husband. He's broken his leg too. So they say, the general was saying. This is beyond everything. Without answering her husband, Anna lifted her opera glass and gazed towards the place where Vronsky had fallen. But it was so far off, and there was such a crowd of people about it, that she could make out nothing. She laid down the opera glass and would have moved away. But at that moment an officer galloped up and made some announcement to the Tsar. Anna craned forward, listening. Stiva, she cried to her brother. But her brother did not hear her again. She would have moved away once more. I offer you my arm if you want to be going, said Alexei Alexandrovich, reaching towards her hand. She drew back from him with aversion, and without looking in his face answered, no, let me be, I'll stay. She saw now that from the place of Vronsky's accident an officer was running across the course towards the pavilion. Betsy waved her handkerchief to him. The officer brought the news that the rider was not killed, but the horse had broken its back. On hearing this, Anna sat down hurriedly and hid her face in her fan. Alexei Alexandrovich saw that she was weeping and could not control her tears, nor even the sobs that were shaking her bosom. Alexei Alexandrovich stood so as to screen her, giving her time to recover herself. For the third time, I offer you my arm, he said to her. After a little time, turning to her, Anna gazed at him and did not know what to say. Princess Betsy came to her rescue. No, Alexei Alexandrovich, I brought Anna and I promised to take her home, put in Betsy. Excuse me, Princess, he said, smiling courteously, but looking at her firmly in the face. But I see that Anna's not very well, and I wish her to come home with me. Anna looked about her in a frightened way, got up submissively, and laid her hand on her husband's arm. I'll send to him and find out, and let you know, Betsy whispered to her as they left the pavilion. Alexei Alexandrovich has always talked to those he met, and Anna had as always to talk and answer. But she was utterly beside herself and moved, hanging on her husband's arm as though in a dream. Is he killed or not? Is it true? Will he come or not? Shall I see him today? She was thinking. She took her seat in her husband's carriage in silence, and in silence drove out of the crowd of carriages. In spite of all he had seen, Alexei Alexandrovich still did not allow himself to consider his wife's real condition. He merely saw the outward symptoms. He saw that she was behaving unbecomingly, and considered it his duty to tell her so. But it was very difficult for him not to say more, to tell her nothing, but that he opened his mouth to tell her she had behaved unbecomingly. But he could not help saying something utterly different. What an inclination we all have, though, for these cruel spectacles. He said, I observe. I don't understand, said Anna contemptuously. He was offended, and at once began to say what he'd meant to say. I am obliged to tell you, he began. So now we're going to have it out, she thought, and she felt frightened. I am obliged to tell you that your behavior has been unbecoming today, he said to her in French. In what way has my behavior been unbecoming? She said aloud, turning her head swiftly and looking him straight in the face, not with the bright expression that seemed covering something, but with a look of determination under which she concealed with difficulty the dismay she was feeling. Mind, he said, pointing to the open window opposite the coachman. He got up and pulled up the window. What did you consider unbecoming? She repeated, the despair you were unable to conceal at the accident to one of the riders. He waited for her to answer, but she was silent, looking straight before her. I have already begged you so to conduct yourself in society that even malicious tongues can find nothing to say against you. There was a time when I spoke of your inward attitude, but I am not speaking of that now. Now I speak only of your external attitude. You have behaved improperly, and I would wish it not to occur again. She did not hear half of what he was saying. She felt panic-stricken before him, and was thinking whether it was true that Vronsky was not killed. Was it of him they were speaking when they said the rider was unhurt, but the horse had broken its back? She merely smiled with a pretense of irony when he finished, and made no reply, because she had not heard what he said. Alexei Alexandrovich had begun to speak boldly, but as he realized plainly what he was speaking of, the dismay she was feeling infected him too. He saw the smile, and a strange misapprehension came over him. She is smiling at my suspicions. Yes, she tell me directly what she told me before, that there's no foundation for my suspicions, that it's absurd. At that moment, when the revelation of everything was hanging over him, there was nothing he expected so much as that she would answer mockingly as before that his suspicions were absurd and utterly groundless. So terrible to him was what he knew that now he was ready to believe anything, but the expression of her face, scared and gloomy, did not now promise even deception. Possibly I was mistaken, he said. If so, I beg your pardon. No, you are not mistaken, she said, deliberately looking desperately into his cold face. You were not mistaken. I was, and I could not help being in despair. I hear you, but I'm thinking of him. I love him. I am his mistress. I can't bear you. I'm afraid of you, and I hate you. You can do what you like to me. And dropping back into the corner of the carriage, she broke into sobs, hiding her face in her hands. Alexei Alexandrovich did not stir, and kept looking straight before him, but his whole face suddenly bore the solemn rigidity of the dead, and his expression did not change during the whole time of the drive home. On reaching the house, he turned his head to her, still with the same expression. Very well, but I expect a strict observance of the external forms of propriety till such time. His voice shook. As I may take measures to secure my honor and communicate them to you. He got out first and helped her to get out before the servants. He pressed her hand, took his seat in the carriage, and drove back to Petersburg immediately. Afterwards a footman came from Princess Betsy and brought Anna a note I sent to Alexei to find out how he is, and he writes me he is quite well and unhurt, but in despair, so he will be here. She thought what a good thing I told him all. She glanced at her watch. She had still 3 hours to wait and the memories of their last meeting set her blood in flame. My God, how light it is, it's dreadful. But I do love to see his face, and I do love this fantastic light. A husband, oh yes, well thank God, everything's over with him. Chapter 30. In the little German watering place, to which the Sharbatskys had betaken themselves, as in all places indeed where people are gathered together, the usual process, as it were, of the crystallization of society, went on, assigning to each member of that society a definite and unalterable place. Just as the particle of water and frost definitely and unalterably takes the special form of the crystal of snow, so each new person that arrived at the springs was at once placed in his special place. First Sherbatsky samt Kemlin und Tochter, by the apartments they took, and from their name and from the friends they made, were immediately crystallized into a definite place marked out for them. There was visiting the water place. That you're a real German Fürsten, in consequence of which the crystallizing process went on more vigorously than ever. Princess Sherbatskaya wished above everything to present her daughter to this German princess, and the day after their arrival she duly performed this rite. Kitty made a low and graceful curtsy in the very simple, that is to say very elegant, frock that had been ordered her from Paris. The German princess said, I hope the roses will soon come back to this pretty little face, and for the Sharabskys certain definite lines of existence were at once laid down, from which there was no departing. The Sharbatskys made the acquaintance, too, of the family of an English lady somebody, and of a German countess, and her son wounded in the last war, and of a learned Swede, and of M. Canute and his sister. But yet inevitably the Sharapkins were thrown most into the society of a Moscow lady, Maria Yevgenivna Orcheva, and her daughter, whom Kitty disliked, because she had fallen ill like herself over a love affair, and a Moscow colonel whom Kitty had known from childhood and always seen in uniform and epaulets, and who now, with his little eyes and his open neck and flowered cravat, was uncommonly ridiculous and tedious, because there was no getting rid of him. When all this was so firmly established, Kitty began to be very much bored, especially as the prince went away to Carlsbad, and she was left alone with her mother. She took no interest in the people she knew, feeling that nothing fresh would come of them. Her chief mental interest in the watering place consisted in watching and making theories about the people she did not know. It was characteristic of Kitty that she always imagined everything and people in the most favorable light possible, especially so in those she did not know. And now, as she made surmises as to who people were, what were their relations to one another, and what they were like, Kitty endowed them with the most marvelous and noble characters, and found confirmation of her idea in her observations of these people. The one that attracted her most was a Russian girl who'd come to the watering place with an invalid Russian lady. Madame Stahl, as everyone called her, Madame Stahl belonged to the highest society, but she was so ill that she could not walk, and only on exceptionally fine days made her appearance at the springs in an invalid carriage. But it was not so much from ill health as from pride, so Princess Sherbatsky interpreted it that Madame Stahl had not made the acquaintance of anyone among the Russians there. The Russian girl looked after Madame Stahl, and besides that, she was, as Kitty observed, on friendly terms with all the invalids who were seriously ill, and there were many of them at the springs, and looked after them in the most natural way. This Russian girl was not, as Kitty gathered, related to Madame Stahl, nor was she a paid attendant. Madame Stahl called her Varenka, and other people called her Mademoiselle Varenka. Apart from the interest Kitty took in this girl's relations with Madame Stahl and with other unknown persons, Kitty, as often happened, felt an inexplicable attraction to Mademoiselle Varenne, and was aware when their eyes met that she too liked her. Of Mademoiselle Varenka, one would not say that she had passed her first youth, but she was as it were a creature without youth. She might have been taken for 19 or for 30 if her features were criticized separately. She was handsome rather than plain. In spite of the sickly hue of her face, she would have been a good figure too, if it had not been for her extreme thinness and the size of her head, which was too large for her medium height. But she was not likely to be attractive to men. She was like a fine flower, already past its bloom, and without fragrance, though the petals were still withered. Moreover, she would have been unattracted to men also from the lack of just what Kitty had too much of the suppressed fire of vitality and the consciousness of her own attractiveness. She always seemed absorbed in work about which there could be no doubt, and so it seemed she could not take interest in anything outside it. It was just this contrast with her own position that was for Kitty the great attraction of Mademoiselle Varenka. Kitty felt that in her manner of life she would find an example of what she was now so painfully seeking: interest in life, a dignity in life apart from the worldly relations of girls with men, which so revolted Kitty and appeared to her now as a shameful hawking about of goods in search of a purchaser. The more attentively Kitty watched her unknown friend, the more convinced she was this girl was the perfect creature she fancied her, and the more eagerly she wished to make her acquaintance. The two girls used to meet several times a day, and every time they met, Kitty's eyes said, "Who are you? Are you really the exquisite creature I imagine you to be? But for goodness sake, don't suppose," her eyes added, "that I would force my acquaintance on you. I simply admire you, and like you I like you too, and you're very, very sweet, and I should like you better still if I had time," answered the eyes of the unknown girl. Kitty saw indeed that she was always busy. Either she was taking the children of a Russian family home from the Springs, or fetching a shawl for a sick lady and wrapping her up in it, or trying to interest an irritable invalid, or selecting and buying cakes for tea for someone. Soon after the arrival of the Sherbakovskys, there appeared in the morning crowd at the Springs two persons who attracted universal and unfavorable attention. These were a tall man with a stooping figure and huge hands, in an old coat too short for him, with black, simple and yet terrible eyes, and a pock-marked, kind-looking woman, very badly and tastelessly dressed. Recognizing these persons as Russians, Kitty had already in her imagination begun constructing a delightful and touching romance about them. But the princess, having ascertained from the visitors' list that this was Nikolai Levin and Maria Nikolaevna, explained to Kitty what a bad man this Levin was, and all her fancies about these two people vanished, not so much from what her mother told her as from the fact that it was Konstantin's brother. This pair suddenly seemed to Kitty intensely unpleasant. This Levin, with his continual twitching of his head, aroused in her now an irrepressible feeling of disgust. It seemed to her that his big, terrible eyes, which persistently pursued her, expressed a feeling of hatred and contempt, and she tried to avoid meeting him. Chapter 31. It was a wet day. It had been raining all morning, and the invalids, with their parasols, had flocked into the arcades. Kitty was walking there with her mother, and the Moscow colonel, smart and jaunty in his European coat, but ready-made at Frankfurt. They were walking on one side of the arcade, trying to avoid Levin, who was walking on the other side. Varenka, in her dark dress, in a black hat with a turned-down brim, was walking up and down the whole length of the arcade with a blind French woman, and every time she met Kitty, they exchanged friendly glances. "Mama, couldn't I speak to her?" said Kitty, watching her unknown friend and noticing that she was going up to the spring, and that they might come there together. "Oh, if you want us so much, I'll find out about her first and make her acquaintance myself," answered her mother. "What do you see in her? Out of the way, a companion she must be. If you like, I'll make acquaintance with Madame Stahl. I used to know her belle, sir," added the princess, lifting her head haughtily. Kitty knew that the princess was offended that Madame Stahl had seemed to avoid making her acquaintance. "Kitty did not insist. How wonderful she is," she said, gazing at Varenka, just as she handed a glass to the French woman. "Look how natural and sweet it all is. It's so funny to see your engouement," said the princess. "No, we'd better go back," she added, noticing Levin coming towards them with his companion and a German doctor to whom he was talking very noisily and angrily. They turned to go back when suddenly they heard not noisy talk, but shouting. Levin, stopping short, was shouting at the doctor, and the doctor too was excited. A crowd gathered about them. The princess and Kitty beat a hasty retreat while the colonel joined the crowd to find out what was the matter. A few minutes later the colonel overtook them. "What was it?" inquired the princess. "Scandalous and disgraceful," answered the colonel. "The one thing to be dreaded is meeting Russians abroad." That tall gentleman was abusing the doctor, flinging all sorts of insults at him because he wasn't treating him quite as he liked, and he began waving his stick at him. "It's simply a scandal." "Oh, how unpleasant," said the princess. "Well, and how did it end?" Luckily at that point that the one in the mushroom hat intervened. "A Russian lady, I think she is," said the colonel. Mademoiselle Varenka asked Kitty. Yes, she came to the rescue. Before anyone she took the man by the arm and led him away." "There, Mama," said Kitty. "You wonder that I'm Enthusiastic about her the next day, as she watched her unknown friend Kitty, noticed that Mademoiselle Varenne was already on the same terms with Levin and his companion as with her other protégés. She went up to them, entered into conversation with them, and served as interpreter for the woman who could not speak any foreign language. Kitty began to entreat her mother still more urgently to let her make friends with Varenka, and disagreeable as it was to the princess to seem to take the first step in wishing to make the acquaintance of Madame Stahl, who thought fit to give herself, as she made inquiries about Varenka, and having ascertained particulars about her, tending to prove that there could be no harm, though little good, in the acquaintance. She herself approached Varenka and made acquaintance with her, choosing a time when her daughter had gone to the spring while Varenka had stopped outside the baker's. The princess went up to her. "Allow me to make your acquaintance," she said with her dignified smile. "My daughter has lost her heart to you," she said. "Possibly you do not know me." "I am. That feeling is more than reciprocal." Princess Varenka answered hurriedly. "What a good deed you did yesterday to our poor compatriot," said the Princess. Veronica flushed a little. "I don't remember. I don't think I did anything," she said. "Why, you saved that lemon from disagreeable consequences." "Yes, Sacampagne called me, and I tried to pacify him. He's very ill and was dissatisfied with the doctor. I'm used to looking after such invalids." "Yes, I've heard you live at Menton with your aunt, I think, Madame Stoll." "I used to know her belle, sir." "No, she's not my aunt. I call her Mama, but I'm not related to her. I was brought up by her," answered Varenka, flushing a little again. This was so simply said, and so sweet was the truthful and candid expression of her face, that the princess saw why Kitty had taken such a fancy to Varenka. "Well, and what's this Levin going to do?" asked the princess. "He's going away," answered Varenka. At that instant Kitty came up from the spring, beaming with delight that her mother had become acquainted with her unknown friend. "Well, see, Kitty, your intense desire to make friends with Mademoiselle Varenka put in, smiling. "That's what everyone calls me." Kitty blushed with pleasure and slowly, without speaking, pressed her new friend's hand, which did not respond to her pressure, but lay motionless in her hand. The hand did not respond to her pressure, but the face of Mademoiselle Varenka glowed with a soft, glad, though rather mournful smile that showed large but handsome teeth. "I have long wished for this too," she said. "But you are so busy." "Oh no, I'm not at all busy," answered Varenka. But at that moment she had to leave her new friends, because two little Russian girls, children of an invalid, ran up to her. "Varenka, Mama's calling," they cried, and Varenka went after them. Chapter 30. To the particulars which the princess had learned in regard to Varenka's past and her relations with Madame Stahl were as follows. Madame Stahl, of whom some people said that she had worried her husband out of his life, while others said it was he who had made her wretched by his immoral behavior, had always been a woman of weak health and enthusiastic temperament. When after her separation from her husband she gave birth to her only child, the child had died almost immediately, and the family of Madame Stahl, knowing her sensibility and fearing the news would kill her, had substituted another child, a baby born the same night and in the same house in Petersburg, the daughter of the chief cook of the imperial household. This was Varenka. Madame Stahl learned later on that Varenka was not her own child, but she went on bringing her up, especially as very soon afterwards Varenka had not a relation of her own living. Madame Stahl had now been living more than 10 years continuously abroad in the south, never leaving her couch, and some people said that Madame Stahl had made her social position as a philanthropic, highly religious woman. Other people said she really was at heart the highly ethical being, living for nothing but the good of her fellow creatures, which she represented herself to be. No one knew what her faith was, Catholic, Protestant, or Orthodox. But one fact was indubitable: she was in amicable relations with the highest dignitaries of all the churches and sects. Varenka lived with her all the while abroad, and everyone who knew Madame Stoll knew and liked Mademoiselle Varenka, as everyone called her. Having learned all these facts, the princess found nothing to object to in her daughter's intimacy with Varenka, more especially as Varenka's breeding and education were of the best. She spoke French and English extremely well, and what was of the most weight, brought a message from Madame Stahl expressing her regret that she was prevented by her ill health from making the acquaintance of the princess. After getting to know Varenka, Kitty became more and more fascinated by her friend, and every day she discovered new virtues in her. The princess, hearing that Varenka had a good voice, asked her to come and sing to them in the evening Kitty plays. And we have a piano, not a good one, it's true, but you'll give us so much pleasure, said the princess with her affected smile, which Kitty disliked particularly just then, because she noticed that Veronica had no inclination to sing. Veronica came, however, in the evening and brought a roll of music with her. The princess had invited Maria Yevgenyevna and her daughter, and the Colonel Veronica seemed quite unaffected by there being persons present she did not know, and she went directly to the piano. She could not accompany herself, but she could sing music at sight very well. Kitty, who played well, accompanied her. You have an extraordinary talent, the princess said to her, after Veronica had sung the first song extremely well. Maria Yevgenyevna and her daughter expressed their thanks and admiration. Look, said the colonel, looking out of the window, what an audience has collected to listen to you. There actually was quite a considerable crowd under the windows. I am very glad it gives you pleasure, Veronica answered simply. Kitty looked with pride at her friend. She was enchanted by her talent and her voice and her face, but most of all by her manner. By the way, Veronica obviously thought nothing of her singing and was quite unmoved by their praises. She seemed only to be asking, am I to sing again? Or is that enough? If it had been, I thought, Kitty, how proud I should have been, how delighted I should have been to see that crowd under the windows, but she's utterly unmoved by it. Her only motive is to avoid refusing and to please Mama. What is there in her? What is it gives her the power to look down on everything, to be calm independently of everything? How I should like to know it and learn it of her, thought Kitty, gazing into her serene face. The princess asked Veronica to sing again, and Veronica sang another song, also smoothly, distinctly, and well, standing erect at the piano and beating time on it with her thin dark-skinned hand. The next song in the book was in Italian. One. Kitty played the opening bars and looked round at Veronica. Let's skip that, said Veronica, flushing a little. Kitty let her eyes rest on Veronica's face with a look of dismay and inquiry. Very well, the next one, she said, hurriedly turning over the pages and at once feeling that there was something connected with the song. No, answered Veronica with a smile, laying her hand on the music. No, let's have that one. And she sang it just as quietly, as coolly, and as well as the others. When she had finished, they all thanked her again and went off to tea. Kitty and Veronica went out into the little garden that adjoined the house. Am I right that you have some reminiscences connected with that song? Said Kitty. Don't tell me, she added hastily, only say if I'm right. No, why not? I'll tell you, simply said Veronica, and without waiting for a reply she went on. Yes, it brings up memories, once painful ones. I cared for someone once, and I used to sing him that song. Kitty, with big wide open eyes, gazed silently, sympathetically at Veronica. I cared for him and he cared for me, but his mother did not wish it, and he married another girl. He's living now not far from us, and I see him sometimes. You didn't think I had a love story, she said, and there was a faint gleam in her handsome face of that fire which Kitty felt must once have glowed all over her. I didn't think so. Why, if I were a man I could never care for anyone else. After knowing you only, I can't understand how he could to please his mother forget you and make you unhappy. He had no heart. Oh no, he's a very good man, and I'm not unhappy, quite the contrary. I'm very happy. Well, so we shan't be singing anymore now, she added, turning towards the house. How good you are, cried Kitty, and stopping her she kissed her. If I could only be even a little like you. Why should you be like anyone? You're nice as you are, said Veronica, smiling her gentle weary smile. No, I'm not nice at all. Come, tell me. Stop a minute, let's sit down, said Kitty, making her sit down again beside her. Tell me, isn't it humiliating to think that a man has disgraced your love, that he hasn't cared for it? But he didn't desecrate it. I believe he cared for me, but he was a dutiful son, yes, but if it hadn't been on account of his mother, if it had been his own doing, said Kitty, feeling she was giving away her secret, and that her face, burning with the flush of shame, had betrayed her already. In that case, he would have done wrong, and I should not have regretted him, answered Veronica, evidently realizing that they were now talking not of her but of Kitty. But the humiliation, said Kitty, the humiliation one can never forget, she said, remembering her look at the last ball during the pause in the music. Where's the humiliation? Why, you did nothing wrong, worse than wrong. Shameful. Veronica shook her head and laid her hand on Kitty's hand. Why, what is there shameful? She said. You didn't tell a man who didn't care for you that you loved him, did you? Of course not. I never said a word. But he knew it. No, there are looks, there are ways, I can't forget it. If I live 100 years, why? So I don't understand. The whole point is whether you love him now or not, said Veronica, who called everything by its name. I hate him, I can't forgive myself. Why? What? For the shame, the humiliation. Oh, if everyone were as sensitive as you are, said Veronica. There isn't a girl who hasn't been through the same, and it's also unimportant. Why? What is important, said Kitty, looking into her face with inquisitive wonder. Oh, there's so much more that's important, said Veronica, smiling. Why? What? Oh, so much that's more important, answered Veronica, not knowing what to say. But at that instant they heard the princess's voice from the window. Kitty, it's cold, either get a shawl or come indoors. It really is time to go, and said Veronica, getting up. I have to go on to Madame Bert's. She asked me to. Kitty held her by the hand, and with passionate curiosity and entreaty her eyes asked her, what is it? What is this of such importance that gives you such tranquility? You know, tell me. But Veronica did not even know what Kitty's eyes were asking her. She merely thought that she had to go see Madame Berthe that evening, and to make haste home in time for Mama's tea at 12 o'clock. She went indoors, collected her music, and saying goodbye to everyone was about to go. Allow me to see you home, said the colonel. Yes. How can you go alone at night like this, chimed the princess. Anyway, I'll send Parasha. Kitty saw that Veronica could hardly restrain a smile at the idea that she needed an escort. No, I always go about alone, and nothing ever happens to me, she said, taking her hat and kissing Kitty once more. Without saying what was important, she stepped out courageously with the music under her arm and vanished into the twilight of the summer night, bearing away with her her secret of what was important and what gave her the calm and dignity so much to be envied. Chapter 33. Kitty made the acquaintance of Madame Stahl too, and this acquaintance, together with her friendship with Veronica, did not merely exercise a great influence on her, it also comforted her in her mental distress. She found this comfort through a completely new world being opened to her by means of this acquaintance, a world having nothing in common with her past, an exalted, noble world from the height of which she could contemplate her past calmly. It was revealed to her that, besides the instinctive life to which Kitty had given herself up hitherto, there was a spiritual life. This life was disclosed in religion, but a religion having nothing in common with the one which Kitty had known from childhood, and which found expression in litanies and all-night services at the widow's home, where one might meet one's friends, and in learning by heart's Levinic texts with the priest. This was a lofty, mysterious religion, connected with a whole series of noble thoughts and feelings which one could do more than merely believe, because one was told to, which one could love. Kitty found all this out not from words. Madame Stahl talked to Kitty as to a charming child that one looks on with pleasure, as on the memory of one's youth, and only once she said in passing that in all human sorrows nothing gives comfort but love and faith, and that in the sight of Christ's compassion for us no sorrow is trifling, and immediately talked of other things, but in every gesture of Madame Stahl, in every word, in every heavenly, as Kitty called it, look, and above all in the whole story of her life, which she heard from Veronica, Kitty recognized that something that was important, of which till then she had known nothing, yet elevated as Madame Stahl's character was touching as was her story, and exalted and moving as was her speech. Kitty could not help detecting in her some traits which perplexed her. She noticed that when questioning her about her family, Madame Stahl had smiled contemptuously, which was not in accord with Christian meekness. She noticed too that when she'd found a Catholic priest with her, Madame Stahl had studiously kept her face in the shadow of the lampshade, and had smiled in a peculiar way. Trivial as these two observations were, they perplexed her, and she had her doubts as to Madame Stahl. On the other hand, Veronica, alone in the world, without friends or relations, with a melancholy disappointment in the past, desiring nothing, regretting nothing, was just that perfection of which Kitty dared hardly dream. In Veronica she realized that one has but to forget oneself and love others, and one will be calm, happy, and noble. And that was what Kitty longed to be, seeing now clearly what was the most important. Kitty was not satisfied with being enthusiastic over it. She at once gave herself up with her whole soul to the new life that was opening to her from Veronica's accounts of the doings of Madame Stahl and other people whom she mentioned. Kitty had already constructed the plan of her own future life. She would, like Madame Stahl's niece Eileen, of whom Veronica had talked to her a great deal, seek out those who were in trouble, Wherever she might be living, help them as far as she could give them the gospel. Read the gospel to the sick, to criminals, to the dying. The idea of reading the gospel to criminals, as Eileen did, particularly fascinated Kitty. But all these were secret dreams of which Kitty did not talk either to her mother or to Varenka while awaiting the time for carrying out her plans on a large scale. However, Kitty, even then at the springs where there were so many people ill and unhappy, readily found a chance for practicing her new principles in imitation of Varenka. At first the princess noticed nothing, but the Kitty was much under the influence of her enguemo, as she called it, for Madame Stahl, and still more for Varenka. She saw that Kitty did not merely imitate Varenka in her conduct, but unconsciously imitated her in her manner of walking, of talking, of blinking her eyes. But later on the princess noticed that apart from this adoration, some kind of serious spiritual change was taking place in her daughter. The princess saw that in the evenings Kitty read a French testament that Madame Stahl had given her, a thing she had never done before, that she avoided society acquaintances and associated with the sick people who were under Varenka's protection, and especially one poor family, that of a sick painter, Petrov. Kitty was unmistakably proud of playing the part of a sister of mercy in that family. All this was well enough, and the princess had nothing to say against it, especially as Petrov's wife was a perfectly nice sort of woman, and that the German princess, noticing Kitty's devotion, praised her, calling her an angel of consolation. All this would have been very well if there had been no exaggeration, but the princess saw that her daughter was rushing into extremes, and so indeed she told her, "Il ne faut jamais uter." She said to her daughter made her no reply. Only in her heart she thought that one could not talk about exaggeration where Christianity was concerned. What exaggeration could there be in the practice of a doctrine wherein one was bidden to turn the other cheek when one was smitten, and give one's cloak if one's cloak were taken? But the princess disliked this exaggeration, and disliked even more the fact that she felt her daughter did not care to show her all her heart. Kitty did in fact conceal her new views and feelings from her mother. She concealed them not because she did not respect or did not love her mother, but simply because she was her mother. She would have revealed them to anyone sooner than to her mother. "How is it Anna Pavlova has not been to see us for so long?" the princess said one day of Madame Petrova. "I've asked her, but she seems put out about something." "No, I've not noticed it," Mama said. Kitty, flushing hotly. "Is it long since you went to see them? We're meaning to make an expedition to the mountains tomorrow," answered Kitty. "Well, you can go," answered the princess, gazing at her daughter's embarrassed face and trying to guess the cause of her embarrassment. That day Varenka came to dinner and told them that Anna Pavlova had changed her mind and given up the expedition for tomorrow, and the princess noticed again that Kitty reddened. "Kitty, haven't you had some misunderstanding with the Petrovs?" said the princess when they were left alone. "Why has she given up sending the children and coming to see us?" Kitty answered that nothing had happened between them, and that she could not tell why Anna Pavlovna seemed displeased with her. Kitty answered perfectly truly she did not know the reason Anna Pavlovna had changed to her, but she guessed it. She guessed at something which she could not tell her mother, which she did not put into words to herself. It was one of those things which one knows, but which one can never speak of even to oneself, so terrible and shameful. Would it be to be mistaken again and again? She went over in her memory all her relations with the family. She remembered the simple delight expressed on the round, good-humored face of Anna Pavlova at their meetings. She remembered their secret confabulations about the invalid, their plots to draw him away from the work which was forbidden him and to get him out of doors, the devotion of the youngest boy who used to call her "my Kitty" and would not go to bed without her. How nice it all was. Then she recalled the thin, terribly thin figure of Petrov, with his long neck and his brown coat, his scant curly hair, his questioning blue eyes that were so terrible to Kitty at first, and his painful attempts to seem hearty and lively in her presence. She recalled the efforts she had made at first to overcome the repugnance she felt for him, as for all consumptive people, and the pains it had caused her to think of things to say to him. She recalled the timid, softened look with which he gazed at her, and the strange feeling of compassion and awkwardness, and later a sense of her own goodness, which she had felt at it. How nice it all was. But all that was at first. Now, a few days ago, everything was suddenly spoiled. Anna Pavlovna had met Kitty with affected cordiality and had kept continual watch on her, and on her husband could that touching pleasure he showed when she came near be. The cause of Anna Pavlova's coolness? Yes, she mused, there was something unnatural about Anna Pavlovna, and utterly unlike her good nature when she said angrily the day before yesterday, "There, he'll keep waiting for you, he wouldn't drink his coffee without you though he's grown so dreadfully weak." Yes, perhaps too she didn't like it when I gave him the rug. It was all so simple, but he took it so awkwardly, and was so long thanking me that I felt awkward too. And then that portrait of me he did so well, and most of all that look of confusion and tenderness. Yes, yes, that's a Kitty repeated to herself with horror. No, it can't be, it oughtn't to be, he's so much to be pitied, she said to herself directly after this doubt poisoned the charm of her new life. Chapter 34. Before the end of the course of drinking the waters, Prince Sherbatsky, who had gone on from Karlsbad to Baden and Kissingen to Russian friends to get a breath of Russian air, as he said, came back to his wife and daughter. The views of the prince and of the princess on life abroad were completely opposed. The princess thought everything delightful, and in spite of her established position in Russian society, she tried abroad to be like a European fashionable lady, which she was not, for the simple reason that she was a typical Russian gentlewoman, and so she was affected, which did not altogether suit her. The prince, on the contrary, thought everything foreign detestable, got sick of European life, kept to his Russian habits, and purposely tried to show himself abroad less European than he was in reality. The prince returned thinner, with the skin hanging in loose bags on his cheeks, but in the most cheerful frame of mind. His good humor was even greater when he saw Kitty completely recovered. The news of Kitty's friendship with Madame Stahl and Veronica, and the reports the princess gave him of some kind of change she had noticed in Kitty, troubled the prince and aroused his habitual feeling of jealousy of everything that drew his daughter away from him, and a dread that his daughter might have got out of the reach of his influence into regions inaccessible to him. But these unpleasant matters were all drowned in the sea of kindliness and good humor, which was always within him, and more so than ever since his course of Carlsbad waters. The day after his arrival, the prince, in his long overcoat with his Russian wrinkles and baggy cheeks propped up by a starched collar, set off with his daughter to the spring in the greatest good humor. It was a lovely morning. The bright, cheerful houses with their little gardens, the sight of the red-faced, red-armed, beer-drinking German waitresses working away merrily, did the heart good. But the nearer they got to the springs, the oftener they met sick people, and their appearance seemed more pitiable than ever among the everyday conditions of prosperous German life. Kitty was no longer struck by this contrast. The bright sun, the brilliant green of the foliage, the strains of the music were for her the natural setting of all these familiar faces, with their changes to greater emaciation or to convalescence, for which she watched. But to the prince the brightness and gaiety of the June morning, and the sound of the orchestra playing a gay waltz then in fashion, and above all the appearance of the healthy attendants, seemed something unseemly and monstrous in conjunction with these slowly moving, dying figures gathered together from all parts of Europe. In spite of his feeling of pride, and as it were of the return of youth, with his favorite daughter on his arm, he felt awkward and almost ashamed of his vigorous step and his sturdy, stout limbs. He felt almost like a man not dressed in a crowd. "Present me to your new friends," he said to his daughter, squeezing her hand with his elbow. "I like even your horrid sodden for making you so well again. Only it's melancholy, very melancholy here." "Who's that?" Kitty mentioned the names of all the people they met, with some of whom she was acquainted, and some not. At the entrance of the garden, they met the blind lady Madame Bert with her guide, and the prince was delighted to see the old French woman's face light up when she heard Kitty's voice. She at once began talking to him with French exaggerated politeness, applauding him for having such a delightful daughter, extolling Kitty to the skies before her face, and calling her a treasure, a pearl, and a consoling angel. "Well, she's the second angel," then said the prince, smiling. "She calls Mademoiselle Varenica angel number one. Oh, Mademoiselle Varenica, she's a real angel." Ali Madame Bert assented. In the arcade they met Varenka herself. She was Walking rapidly towards them, carrying an elegant red bag. "Here's Papa, come," Kitty said to her. Varenka made simply and naturally, as she did everything, a movement between a bow and a curtsy, and immediately began talking to the prince without shyness. Naturally, as she talked to everyone. "Of course, I know you very well," the prince said to her with a smile in which Kitty detected with joy that her father liked her friend. "Where are you off to in such haste?" "Mama's here," she said, turning to Kitty. "She's not slept all night, and the doctor advised her to go out. I'm taking her work, so that's Angel no one," said the prince. When Veronica had gone on, Kitty saw that her father had meant to make fun of Veronica, but that he could not do it because he liked her. "Come, so we shall see all your friends," he went on, "even Madame Stahl, if she deigns to recognize me." "Why did you know her, Papa?" Kitty asked, apprehensively, catching the gleam of irony that kindled in the prince's eyes at the mention of Madame Stahl. "I used to know her husband, and her too, a little before she joined the Pietists." "What is a Pietist, Papa?" asked Kitty, dismayed to find that what she prized so highly in Madame Stahl had a name. "I don't quite know myself. I only know that she thanks God for everything, for every misfortune, and thanks God too that her husband died. And that's rather droll, as they didn't get on together." "Who's that? What a piteous face," he asked, noticing a sick man of medium height sitting on a bench wearing a brown overcoat and white trousers that fell in strange folds about his long fleshless legs. This man lifted his straw hat, showed his scanty curly hair and high forehead painfully reddened by the pressure of the hat. "That's Petrov, an artist," answered Kitty, blushing. "And that's his wife," she added, indicating Anna Pavlova, who, as though on purpose, at the very instant they approached, walked away after a child that had run off along a path. "Poor fellow, and what a nice face he has," said the prince. "Why don't you go up to him? He wanted to speak to you." "Well, let us go then," said Kitty, turning around resolutely. "How are you feeling today?" she asked Petrov. Petrov got up, leaning on his stick, and looked shyly at the prince. "This is my daughter," said the prince. "Let me introduce myself." The painter bowed and smiled, showing his strangely dazzling white teeth. "We expected you yesterday, princess," he said to Kitty. He staggered as he said this, and then repeated the motion, trying to make it seem as if it had been intentional. "I meant to come, but Veronica said that Anna Pavlova sent word." "You are not going," said Petrov, blushing, and immediately began to cough, and his eyes sought his wife. Anita," he said loudly, and the swollen veins stood out like cords on his white neck. Anna Pavlovna came up. "So you sent word to the princess that we weren't going," he whispered to her, angrily losing his voice. "Good morning, princess," said Anna Pavlovna, with an assumed smile, utterly unlike her former manner. "Very glad to make your acquaintance," she said to the prince. "You've long been expected, prince." "What did you send word to the princess? That we weren't going?" For the artist whispered hoarsely once more, still more angry, obviously exasperated that his voice failed him, so that he could not give his words the expression he would have liked to. "Oh, mercy on us, I thought we weren't going," his wife answered crossly. "What?" When he coughed and waved his hand, the prince took off his hat and moved away with his daughter. "Ah," he sighed deeply. "Oh, poor things." "Yes, Papa," answered Kitty, "and you must know they've 3 children, no servant, and scarcely any means. He gets something from the academy," she went on briskly, trying to drown the distress that the queer change in Anna Pavlova's manner to her had aroused in her. "Oh, there's Madame Stahl," said Kitty, indicating an invalid carriage where, propped on pillows, something in gray and blue was lying under a sunshade. This was Madame Stahl. Behind her stood the gloomy, healthy-looking German workman who pushed the carriage. Close by was standing a flaxen-headed Swedish count, whom Kitty knew by name. Several invalids were lingering near the low carriage, staring at the lady as though she were some curiosity. The prince went up to her, and Kitty detected that disconcerting gleam of irony in his eyes. He went up to Madame Stahl and addressed her with extreme courtesy and affability in that excellent French that so few speak nowadays. "I don't know if you remember me, but I must recall myself to thank you for your kindness to my daughter," he said, taking off his hat and not putting it on again. "Prince Alexander Sherbatsky," said Madame Stahl, lifting upon him her heavenly eyes, in which Kitty discerned a look of annoyance. "Delighted. I have taken a great fancy to your daughter. You are still in weak health." "Yes, I'm used to it," said Madame Stahl as she introduced the prince to the Swedish count. "You are scarcely changed at all," the prince said to her. "It's 10 or 11 years since I had the honor of seeing you." "Yes, God sends the cross and sends the strength to bear it. Often one wonders, what is the goal of this life, the other side, she said angrily to Varenka, who had rearranged the rug over her feet not to her satisfaction. To do good probably, said the prince with a twinkle in his eye. That is not for us to judge, said Madame Stahl, perceiving the shade of expression on the prince's face. So you will send me that book, dear Count? I'm very grateful to you, she said to the young Swede. Ah, cried the prince, catching sight of the Moscow colonel standing near, and with a bow to Madame Stahl, he walked away with his daughter and the Moscow colonel, who joined them. That's our aristocracy, prince, the Moscow colonel said with ironical intention. He cherished a grudge against Madame Stahl for not making his acquaintance. She's just the same, replied the prince. Did you know her before her illness, prince? That's to say, before she took to her bed. Yes, she took to her bed before my eyes, said the prince. They say it's 10 years since she stood on her feet. She doesn't stand up because her legs are too short. She's a very bad figure, Papa. It's not possible, cried Kitty. That's what wicked tongues say, my darling, and your Varenka catches it too, he added. Oh, these invalid ladies. Oh no, Papa, Kitty objected warmly. Varenka worships her, and then she does so much good. Ask anyone, everyone knows her in Alien Stall. Perhaps so, said the prince, squeezing her hand with his elbow, but it's better when one does good, so that you may ask everyone, and no one knows. Kitty did not answer, not because she had nothing to say, but because she did not care to reveal her secret thoughts even to her father. But strange to say, although she had so made up her mind not to be influenced by her father's views, not to let him into her inmost sanctuary, she felt that the heavenly image of Madame Stahl, which she had carried for a whole month in her heart, had vanished, never to return. Just as the fantastic figure made up of some clothes thrown down at random vanishes, when one sees that it's only some garment lying there, all that was left was a woman with short legs who lay down because she had a bad figure, and worried patient Forenza for not arranging her rug to her liking, and by no effort of the imagination could Kitty bring back the former Madame Stahl. Chapter 35. The prince communicated his good humor to his family and his friends, and even to the German landlord in whose rooms the Sharapetskys were staying. On coming back with Kitty from the Springs, the prince, who had asked the colonel and Maria Yevgenyevna and Varenka all to come and have coffee with them, gave orders for a table and chairs to be taken into the garden under the chestnut tree, and lunch to be laid there. The landlord and the servants to grew brisker under the influence of his good spirits. They knew his open-handedness, and half an hour later the invalid doctor from Hamburg, who lived on the top floor, looked enviously out of the window at the merry party of healthy Russians assembled under the chestnut tree in the trembling circles of shadow cast by the leaves at a table covered with a white cloth and set with coffee pot, bread and butter, cheese and cold games. At the princess in a high cap with lilac ribbons, distributing cups and bread and butter. At the other end sat the prince, eating heartily and talking loudly and merrily. The prince had spread out near him his purchases, carved boxes and knickknacks, paper knives of all sorts, of which he bought a heap at every watering place and bestowed them upon everyone, including Lishkin, the servant girl, and the landlord, with whom he jested in his comically bad German, assuring him that it was not the water had cured Kitty, but his splendid cookery, especially his plum soup. The princess laughed at her husband for his Russian ways, but she was more lively and good-humored than she had been all the while she'd been at the waters. The colonel smiled, as he always did, at the prince's jokes, but as far as regards Europe, of which he believed himself to be making a careful study, he took the princess's side. The simple-hearted Maria Yevgenyevna simply roared with laughter at everything absurd the prince said, and his jokes made Varenka helpless with feeble but infectious laughter, which was something Kitty had never seen before. Kitty was glad of all this, but she could not be light-hearted. She could not solve the problem her father had unconsciously set her by his good-humored view of her friends and of the life that had so attracted her to his. Doubt there was joined the change in her relations with the Petrovs, which had been so conspicuously and unpleasantly marked that morning everyone was good-humored. But Kitty could not feel good-humored, and this increased her distress. She felt a feeling such as she had known in childhood, when she had been shut in her room as a punishment and had heard her sister's merry laughter outside. Well, but what did you buy this mass of things for? Said the princess, smiling and handing her husband a cup of coffee. One goes for a walk, looks in a shop, and they ask you to buy airlock Dirk lock directly. They say Dirk locked, I can't hold out, I lose $10. It's simply from boredom, said the princess. Of course, it is such boredom, my dear, that one doesn't know what to do with oneself. How can you be bored, prince? There's so much that's interesting now in Germany, said Maria Yevgenyevna. But I know everything that's interesting. The plum soup I know, and the pea sausages. I know everything. No, you may say what you like, prince. There's the interest of the institutions, said the colonel. But what is there interesting about it? They're all as pleased as brass halfpence. They've conquered everybody. And why am I to be pleased at that? I haven't conquered anyone, and I'm obliged to take off my own boots, yes, and put them away too in the morning, get up and dress at once, and go to the dining room to drink bad tea. How different it is at home. You get up in no haste, you get cross, grumble a little and come round again. You've time to think things over, and no hurry. But time's money, you forget that, said the colonel. Time, indeed, that depends. Why, there's time one would give a month of for sixpence, and time you wouldn't give half an hour of for any money. Isn't that so, Katinka? What is it? Why are you so depressed? I'm not depressed. Where are you off to? Stay a little longer, he said to Veronica. I must be going home, said Veronica, getting up, and again she went off into a giggle when she had recovered. She said goodbye and went into the house to get her hat. Kitty followed her. Even Veronica struck her as different. She was not worse, but different from what she had fancied before. Oh dear, it's a long time since I've laughed so much, said Veronica, gathering up her parasol in her bag. How nice he is, your father. Kitty did not speak. When shall I see you again? asked Veronica. Mama meant to go and see the Petrovs. Won't you be there? said Kitty to try Veronica. Yes, answered Veronica. They're getting ready to go away, so I promised to help them pack. Well, I'll come to then. No, why should you? Why not? Why not? Why not? said Kitty, opening her eyes wide and clutching at Veronica's parasol so as not to let her go. No, wait a minute. Why not? Oh, nothing. Your father has come, and besides, they'll feel awkward at your helping. No, tell me why you don't want me to be often at the Petrovs. You don't want me to? Why not? I didn't say that, said Veronica quietly. No, please tell me. Tell you everything? asked Veronica. Everything, Kitty assented. Well, there's really nothing of any consequence, only that Mikhail Alexeyevich, that was the artist's name, had meant to leave earlier, and now he doesn't want to go away, said Veronica, smiling. Well, Kitty urged impatiently, looking darkly at Veronica. Well, and for some reason Anna Pavlovna told him that he didn't want to go, because you are here. Of course, that was nonsense, but there was a dispute over you. You know how irritable these sick people are. Kitty, scowling more than ever, kept silent, and Veronica went on speaking alone, trying to soften or soothe her, and seeing a storm coming. She did not know whether of tears or of words. So you'd better not go, you understand? You won't be offended, and it serves me right, and it serves me right. Kitty cried quickly, snatching the parasol out of Veronica's hand, and looking past her friend's face. Veronica felt inclined to smile, looking at her childish fury, but she was afraid of wounding her. How does it serve you right? I don't understand, she said. It serves me right because it was all a sham, because it was all done on purpose and not from the heart. What business had I to interfere with outsiders? And so it's come about that I'm a cause of quarrel, and that I've done what nobody asked me to do, because it was all a sham, a sham, a sham, a sham. With what object? said Veronica gently. Oh, it's so idiotic, so hateful. There was no need whatever for me. Nothing but sham, she said, opening and shutting the parasol. But with what object? To seem better to people, to myself, to God, to deceive everyone. No, now I won't assent to that. I'll be bad, but anyway, not a liar, a cheat. But who is a cheat? said Veronica reproachfully. You speak as if. But Kitty was in one of her gusts of fury, and she would not let her finish. I don't talk about you, not about you at all. Your perfection, yes, I know you're all perfection. But what am I to do if I'm bad? This would never have been if I weren't bad, so let me be. What I am, I won't be a sham. What have I to do with Anna Pavlovna? Let them go their way, and me go mine. I can't be different. And yet it's not that. What is not that? asked Veronica in bewilderment. Everything. I can't act except from the heart, and you act from principle. I liked you simply, but you most likely only wanted to save me, to improve me. You are unjust, said Veronica. But I'm not speaking of other people. I'm speaking of myself. Kitty, they heard her mother's voice. Come here. Show your papa your necklace. Kitty, with a haughty air, without making peace with her friend, took the necklace in a little box from the table and went to her mother. "What's the matter? Why are you so red?" Her mother and father said to her with one voice. "Nothing," she answered. "I'll be back directly." And she ran back. She's still here, she thought. What am I to say to her? Oh dear, what have I done? What have I said? Why was I rude to her? What am I to do? What am I to say to her? Thought Kitty, and she stopped in the doorway. Virjank, in her hat and with the parasol in her hands, was sitting at the table examining the spring, which Kitty had broken. She lifted her head. "Virginsita, forgive me, do forgive me," whispered Kitty, going up to her. "I don't remember what I said. I really didn't mean to hurt you," said Virginsita, smiling. Peace was made. But with her father's coming, all the world in which she had been living was transformed for Kitty. She did not give up everything she had learned, but she became aware that she had deceived herself in supposing she could be what she wanted to be. Her eyes, where it seemed open, she felt all the difficulty of maintaining herself without hypocrisy and self-conceit on the pinnacle to which she had wished to mount. Moreover, she became aware of all the dreariness of the world of sorrow, of sick and dying people in which she had been living. The effort she had made to like it seemed to her intolerable, and she felt a longing to get back quickly into the fresh air, to Russia, to Urgojovo, where she knew from her letters her sister Dolly had already gone with her children. But her affection for Veronika did not wane as she said goodbye. Kitty begged her to come to them in Russia. "I'll come when you get married," said Veronika. "I shall never marry. Well, then I shall never come. Well, then I shall be married simply for that. Mind, now remember your promise," said Kitty. The doctor's prediction was fulfilled. Kitty returned home to Russia cured. She was not so gay and thoughtless as before, but she was serene. Her Moscow troubles had become a memory to her. Part 3, Chapter 1. Sergei Ivanovich Kosenkov wanted a rest from mental work, and instead of going abroad as he usually did, he came towards the end of May to stay in the country with his brother. In his judgment, the best sort of life was a country life. He had come now to enjoy such a life at his brother's. Konstantin Levin was very glad to have him, especially as he did not expect his brother Nikolai that summer. But in spite of his affection and respect for Sergei Ivanovich, Konstantin Levin was uncomfortable with his brother in the country. It made him uncomfortable, and it positively annoyed him to see his brother's attitude to the country. To Konstantin Levin, the country was the background of life, that is, of pleasures, endeavors, labor. To Sergei Ivanovich, the country meant on one hand rest from work, on the other a valuable antidote to the corrupt influences of town, which he took with satisfaction and a sense of its utility. To Konstantin Levin, the country was good first, because it afforded a field for labor of the usefulness of which there could be no doubt. To Sergei Ivanovich, the country was particularly good because there it was possible and fitting to do nothing. Moreover, Sergei Ivanovich's attitude to the peasants rather piqued Konstantin. Sergei Ivanovich used to say that he knew and liked the peasantry, and he often talked to the peasants, which he knew how to do without affectation or condescension, and from every such conversation he would deduce general conclusions in favor of the peasantry, and in confirmation of his knowing them. Konstantin Levin did not like such an attitude to the peasants. To Konstantin, the peasant was simply the chief partner in their common labor, and in spite of all the respect and the love, almost like that of kinship, he had for the peasant, sucked in, probably, as he said himself, with the milk of his peasant nurse, still as a fellow worker with him. While sometimes enthusiastic over the vigor, gentleness, and justice of these men, he was very often, when their common labors called for other qualities, exasperated with the peasant for his carelessness, lack of method, drunkenness, and lying. If he had been asked whether he liked or didn't like the peasants, Konstantin Levin would have been absolutely at a loss what to reply. He liked and did not like the peasants, just as he liked and did not like men in general. Of course, being a good-hearted man, he liked men rather than he disliked them, and so too with the peasants. But like or dislike the people as something apart, he could not only because he lived with the people and all his interests were bound up with theirs, but also because he regarded himself as part of the people, did not see any special qualities or failings distinguishing himself and the people, and could not contrast himself with them. Moreover, although he had lived so long in the closest relations with the peasants as farmer and arbitrator, and what was more, as advisor, the peasants trusted him, and for 30 miles round they would come to ask his advice. He had no definite views of the people, and would have been as much at a loss to answer the question whether he knew the people as the question whether he liked them. For him to say he knew the peasantry would have been the same as to say he knew men he was continually watching and getting to know people of all sorts, and among them peasants, whom he regarded as good and interesting people, and he was continually observing new points in them, altering his former views of them and forming new ones with Sergei Ivanovich. It was quite the contrary. Just as he liked and praised a country life in comparison with the life he did not like, so too he liked the peasantry in contradistinction to the class of men he did not like, and so too he knew the peasantry as something distinct from and opposed to men generally. In his methodical brain, there were distinctly formulated certain aspects of peasant life deduced partly from that life itself, but chiefly from contrast with other modes of life. He never changed his opinion of the peasantry and his sympathetic attitude towards them. In the discussions that arose between the brothers on their views of the peasantry, Sergei Ivanovich always got the better of his brother, precisely because Sergei Ivanovich had definite ideas about the peasant, his character, his qualities, his tastes. Konstantin Levin had no definite and unalterable idea on the subject, and so in their arguments, Konstantin was readily convicted of contradicting himself in Sergei Ivanovich's eyes. His younger brother was a capital fellow, with his heart in the right place, as he expressed it in French, but with a mind which, though fairly quick, was too much influenced by the impressions of the moment and consequently filled with contradictions. With all the condescension of an elder brother, he sometimes explained to him the true import of things, but he derived little satisfaction from arguing with him, because he got the better of him too easily. Konstantin Levin regarded his brother as a man of immense intellect and culture, as generous in the highest sense of the word, and possessed of a special faculty for working for the public good. But in the depths of his heart, the older he became, and the more intimately he knew his brother, the more and more frequently the thought struck him that this faculty of working for the public good, of which he felt himself utterly devoid, was possibly not so much a quality as a lack of something, not a lack of good, honest, noble desires and tastes, but a lack of vital force, of what is called heart, of that impulse which drives a man to choose someone out of the innumerable paths of life, and to care only for that one. The better he knew his brother, the more he noticed that Sergei Ivanovich and many other people who worked for the public welfare were not led by an impulse of the heart to care for the public good, but reasoned from intellectual considerations that it was a right thing to take interest in public affairs, and consequently took interest in them. Levin was confirmed in this generalization by observing that his brother did not take questions affecting the public welfare or the question of the immortality of the soul a bit more to heart than he did chess problems or the ingenious construction of a new machine. Besides this, Konstantin Levin was not at ease with his brother, because in summer in the country Levin was continually busy with work on the land, and the long summer day was not long enough for him to get through all he had to do while Sergei Ivanovich was taking a holiday. But though he was taking a holiday now, that is to say, he was doing no writing, he was so used to intellectual activity that he liked to put into concise and eloquent shape the ideas that occurred to him, and liked to have someone to listen to him. His most usual and natural listener was his brother, and so, in spite of the friendliness and directness of their relations, Konstantin felt an awkwardness in leaving him alone. Sergei Ivanovich liked to stretch himself on the grass in the sun, and to lie so basking and chatting lazily. "You wouldn't believe," he would say to his brother, "what a pleasure this rural laziness is to me, not an idea in one's brain as empty as a drum." But Konstantin Levin found it dull sitting and listening to him, especially when he knew that while he was away they would be carting dung onto the fields not plowed ready for it, and heaping it all up anyhow, and would not screw the shares and the plows, but would let them come off, and then say that the new plows were a silly invention, and there was nothing like the old Androvna plow, and so on. "Come, you've done enough trudging about in the heat," Sergei Ivanovich would say to him. "No, I must just run round to the counting house for a minute," Levin would answer, and he would run off to the fields. Early in June it happened that Agafya Mikhailovna, the old nurse and housekeeper, in carrying to the cellar a jar of mushrooms she had just pickled, slipped, fell, and sprained her wrist. The district doctor, a talkative young medical student, who had just finished his studies, came to see her. He examined the wrist, said it was not broken, was delighted at a chance of talking to the celebrated Sergei Ivanovich Kosenkov, and to show his advanced views of things, told him all the scandal of the district, complaining of the poor state into which the district council had fallen. Sergei Ivanovich listened attentively, asked him questions, and roused by a new listener, he talked fluently, uttered a few keen and weighty observations, respectfully appreciated by the young doctor, and was soon in that eager frame of mind his brother knew so well, which always with him followed a brilliant and eager conversation. After the departure of the doctor, he wanted to go with a fishing rod to the river. Sergei Ivanovich was fond of angling, and was, it seemed, proud of being able to care for such a stupid occupation. Konstantin Levin, whose presence was needed in the plowland and meadows, had come to take his brother in the trap. It was that time of year, the turning point of summer, when the crops of the present year are a certainty, when one begins to think of the sowing for next year, and the mowing is at hand, when the rye is all in air, though its ears are still light, not yet full, and it waves in gray-green billows in the wind, when the green oats, with tufts of yellow grass scattered here and there among it, droop irregularly over the late-sown fields, when the early buckwheat is already out and hiding the ground, when the fallow lands, trodden hard as stone by the cattle, are half plowed over, with paths left untouched by the plow, when from the dried dung heaps carted onto the fields there comes at sunset a smell of manure mixed with meadow sweet, and on the low-lying lands, the riverside meadows, are a thick sea of grass, waiting for the mowing, with blackened heaps of stalks of sorrel among it. It was the time when there comes a brief pause in the toil of the fields before the beginning of the labors of harvest, every year, recurring every year, straining every nerve of the peasants. The crop was a splendid one, and bright hot summer days had set in, with short dewy nights. The brothers had to drive through the woods to reach the meadows. Sergei Ivanovich was all the while admiring the beauty of the woods, which were a tangled mass of leaves, pointing out to his brother now an old lime tree on the point of flowering, dark on the shady side and brightly spotted with yellow stipules, now the young shoots of this year's saplings brilliant with emerald. Konstantin Levin did not like talking and hearing about the beauty of nature. Words for him took away the beauty of what he saw. He assented to what his brother said, but he could not help beginning to think of other things. When they came out of the woods, all of his attention was engrossed by the view of the fallow land on the upland, in parts yellow with grass, in parts trampled and checkered with furrows, in parts dotted with ridges of dung, and in parts even plowed. A string of carts was moving across it. Levin counted the carts and was pleased that all that were wanted had been brought, and at the sight of the meadows his thoughts passed to the mowing. He always felt something special moving him to the quick at the haymaking. On reaching the meadow, Levin stopped the horse. The morning dew was still lying on the thick undergrowth of the grass, and that he might not get his feet wet, Sergei Ivanovich asked his brother to drive him in the trap up to the willow tree from which the carp was caught. Sorry, as Konstantin Levin was to crush down his mowing grass, he drove him into the meadow. The high grass softly turned about the wheels, and the horse's legs leaving its seeds clinging to the wet axles and spokes of the wheels. His brother seated himself under a bush arranging his tackle, while Levin led the horse away, fastened him up, and walked into the vast gray-green sea of grass, unstirred by the wind. The silky grass, with its ripe seeds, came up almost to his waist in the dampest spots. Crossing the meadow, Konstantin Levin came out onto the road and met an old man with a swollen eye, carrying a scap on his shoulder. What taking a stray swarm formeth? He asked. No, indeed, Konstantin Dmitrich, all we can do to keep our own. This is the second swarm that's flown away. Luckily the lads caught them. They were plowing your field. They unyoked the horses and galloped after them. Well, what do you say, Fowler? Start mowing or wait a bit? Ah, well, our way is to wait till St. Peter's Day, but you always mow sooner. Well, to be sure, please God. The hay's good, there'll be plenty for the beasts. What do you think about the weather? That's in God's hands. Maybe it will be fine. Levin went up to his brother. Sergei Ivanovich had caught nothing, but he was not bored and seemed in the most cheerful frame of mind. Levin saw that, stimulated by his conversation with the doctor, he wanted to talk. Levin, on the other hand, would have liked to get home as soon as possible to give orders about getting together the mowers for the next day, and to set at rest his doubts about the mowing which greatly absorbed him. "Well, let's be going," he said. "Why be in such a hurry? Let's stay a little." "But how what you are, even though one catches nothing, it's nice. That's the best thing about every part of sport that one has to do with nature. How exquisite the steely water is," said Sergey Ivanovich. "These riverside banks always remind me of the riddle. Do you know it? The grass says to the water, we quiver, and we quiver." "I don't know," the riddle answered. Levin wearily. Chapter 3. "Do you know I've been thinking about you," said Sergey Ivanovich. "It's beyond everything what's being done in the district. According to what this doctor tells me, he's a very intelligent fellow. And as I've told you before, I tell you again, it's not right for you not to go to the meetings and altogether to keep out of the district business. If decent people won't go into it, of course, it's all bound to go wrong. We pay the money, and it all goes in salaries, and there are no schools, nor district nurses, nor midwives, nor drug stores, nothing." "Well, I did try, you know," Levin said slowly and unwillingly. "I can't, and so there's no help for it." "But why can't you?" "I must own I can't make it out. Indifference, incapacity, I won't admit. Surely it's not simply laziness." "None of those things. I've tried, and I see I can do nothing," said Levin. He hardly grasped what his brother was saying. Looking towards the plow and across the river, he made out something black, but could not distinguish whether it was a horse or the bailiff on horseback. "Why is it you can do nothing? You made an attempt and didn't succeed as you think, and you give in. How can you have so little self-respect?" "Self-respect," said Levin, stung to the quick by his brother's words. "I don't understand. If they'd told me at college that other people understood the integral calculus and I didn't, then pride would have come in. But in this case, one wants first to be convinced that one has certain qualifications for this sort of business, and especially that all this business is of great importance." "What do you mean to say it's not of importance?" said Sergey Ivanovich, stung to the quick too at his brother's considering anything of no importance. That interested him, and still more at his obviously paying little attention to what he was saying. "I don't think it important. It does not take hold of me. I can't help it," answered Levin, making out that what he saw was the bailiff, and that the bailiff seemed to be letting the peasants go off the plowed land. They were turning the plow over. "Can they have finished plowing?" he wondered. "Come, really though," said his elder brother with a frown on his handsome, clever face. "There's a limit to everything. It's very well to be original and genuine and to dislike everything conventional. I know all about that. But really what you are saying either has no meaning or has a very wrong meaning. How can you think it a matter of no importance whether the peasant whom you love, as you assert?" "I never did assert it," thought Konstantin Levin, "dies without help. The ignorant peasant women starve the children, and the people stagnate in darkness and are helpless in the hands of every village clerk, while you have at your disposal a means of helping them and don't help them, because to your mind it's of no importance." And Sergey Ivanovich put before him the alternative: either you are so undeveloped that you can't see all that you can do, or you won't sacrifice your ease, your vanity, or whatever else it is to do it. Konstantin Levin felt that there was no course open to him but to submit or to confess to a lack of zeal for the public good, and this mortified him and hurt his feelings. "It's both," he said resolutely, "and I don't see that it was possible." "What was it impossible? If the money were properly laid out to provide medical aid? Impossible, as it seems to me, for the 3,000 square miles of our district, what with our thaws and the storms and the work on the fields. I don't see how it is possible to provide medical aid all over, and besides, I don't believe in medicine." "Oh, well, that's unfair. I can quote to you thousands of instances." "But the schools anyway? Why have schools?" "What do you mean? Can there be two opinions of the advantage of education? If it's a good thing for you, it's a good thing for everyone." Konstantin Levin felt himself morally pinned against a wall, and so he got hot and unconsciously blurted out, "The chief cause of his indifference to public business. Perhaps it may all be very good, but why should I worry myself about establishing dispensaries, which I shall never make use of, and schools to which I shall never send my children, to which even the peasants don't want to send their children, and to which I have no very firm faith that they ought to send them," said he. Sergey Ivanovich was for a minute surprised at this unexpected view of the subject, but he promptly made a new plan of attack. He was silent for a little, drew out a hook, threw it in again, and turned to his brother smiling. Come now, in the first place the dispensary is needed. We ourselves sent for the district doctor for Agafia Mikhailovna. Oh well, but I fancy her wrist will never be straight again. That remains to be proved. Next, the peasant who can read and write is as a workman of more use and value to you. No, you can ask anyone you like. Konstantin Levin answered with decision. The man that can read and write is much inferior as a workman, and mending the high roads is an impossibility. And as soon as they put up bridges, they're stolen still. That's not the point, said Sergei Ivanovich, frowning. He disliked contradiction and still more arguments that were continually skipping from one thing to another, introducing new and disconnected points, so that there was no knowing to which to reply. Do you admit that education is a benefit for the people? Yes, I admit it, said Levin without thinking, and he was conscious immediately that he had said what he did not think. He felt that if he admitted that, it would be proved that he had been talking meaningless rubbish. How it would be proved he could not tell, but he knew that this would inevitably be logically proved to him, and he awaited the proofs. The argument turned out to be far simpler than he had expected. If you admit that it is a benefit, said Sergei Ivanovich, then as an honest man, you cannot help caring about it and sympathizing with the movement and so wishing to work for it. But I still do not admit this movement to be just, said Konstantin Levin, reddening a little. What? But you said just now, that's to say I don't admit its being either good or possible, that you can't tell without making the trial. Well, supposing that's so, said Levin, though he did not suppose so at all. Supposing that is so, still I don't see all the same what I'm to worry myself about it for. How so? No, since we're talking, explain it to me from the philosophical point of view, said Levin. I can't see where philosophy comes in, said Sergei Ivanovich in a tone Levin fancied as though he did not admit his brother's right to talk about philosophy, and that irritated Levin. I'll tell you. Then he said with heat, I imagine the mainspring of all our actions is after all self-interest. Now in the local institutions, as a nobleman, see nothing that could conduce to my prosperity, and the roads are not better and could not be better. My horses carry me well enough over the bad ones. Doctors and dispensaries are of no use to me. An arbitrator of disputes is no use to me. I never appeal to him and never shall appeal to him. The schools are no good to me, but positively harmful, as I told you. For me, the district institutions simply mean the liability to pay fourpence halfpenny for every 3 acres, to drive into the town, sleep with bugs, and listen to all sorts of idiocy and lonesomeness, and self-interest offers me no inducement. Excuse me, Sergei Ivanovich interposed with a smile. Self-interest did not induce us to work for the emancipation of the serfs, but we did work for it. No, Konstantin Levin broke in with still greater heat. The emancipation of the serfs was a different matter. Their self-interest did come in. One longed to throw off that yoke that crushed us all decent people among us, but to be a town councillor and discuss how many dustmen are needed and how chimneys shall be constructed in the town, and which I don't live to serve on a jury and try a peasant who's stolen a flitch of bacon and listen for 6 hours at a stretch to all sorts of jabber from the counsel for the defense and the prosecution, and the president cross-examining my old half-witted Alyoshka. Do you admit, prisoner? And the doc, the fact of the removal of the bacon. Konstantin Levin had warmed to his subject and began mimicking the president and the half-witted Alyoshka. It seemed to him that it was all to the point. But Sergei Ivanov shrugged his shoulders. Well, what do you mean to say? Then I simply mean to say that those rights that touch me, my interest, I shall always defend to the best of my ability. That when they made raids on U.S. students and the police read our letters, I was ready to defend those rights to the utmost, to defend my rights to education and freedom. I can understand compulsory military service, which affects my children, my brothers, and myself. I'm ready to deliberate on what concerns me, but deliberating on how to spend 40,000 rubles of district council money, or judging the half-witted Alyoshka, I don't understand, and I can't do it. Konstantin Levin spoke as though the floodgates of his speech had burst open. Sergei Ivanovich smiled. But tomorrow it'll be your turn to be tried. Would it be suited your tastes better to be tried in the old criminal tribunal? I'm not going to be tried. I shan't murder anybody, and I've no need of it. Well, I tell you what, he went off flying off again to a subject quite beside the point. Our district self-government and all the rest of it. It's just like the birch branches we stick in the ground on Trinity Day, for instance, to look like a corpse. which has grown up of itself in Europe, and I can't gush over these birch branches and believe in them." Sergei Ivanovich merely shrugged his shoulders, as though to express his wonder how the birch branches had come into their argument. At that point, though, he did really understand at once what his brother meant. "Excuse me, but you know, one really can't argue in that way," he observed. But Konstantin Levin wanted to justify himself for the failing of which he was conscious of lack of zeal for the public welfare. And he went on, "I imagine," he said, "that no sort of activity is likely to be lasting if it is not founded on self-interest. That's a universal principle, a philosophical principle," he said, repeating the word philosophical with determination, as though wishing to show that he had as much right as anyone else to talk of philosophy. Sergei Ivanovich smiled. He has a philosophy of his own, at the service of his natural tendencies. He thought, "Come, you'd better let philosophy alone." He said, "The chief problem of the philosophy of all ages consists just in finding the indispensable connection which exists between individual and social interests. But that's not to the point. What is to the point is a correction I must make in your comparison. The birches are not simply stuck in, but some are sown and some are planted, and one must deal carefully with them. It's only those peoples that have an intuitive sense of what's of importance and significance in their institutions and know how to value them that have a future before them. It's only those peoples that one can truly call historical." And Sergei Ivanovich carried the subject into the regions of philosophical history, where Konstantin Levin could not follow him, and showed him all the incorrectness of his view. "As for your dislike of it, excuse my saying so, that's simply our Russian sloth and old serf owner's ways, and I'm convinced that in you it's a temporary error and will pass." Konstantin was silent. He felt himself vanquished on all sides, but he felt at the same time that what he wanted to say was unintelligible to his brother. Only he could not make up his mind whether it was unintelligible because he was not capable of expressing his meaning clearly, or because his brother would not or could not understand him. But he did not pursue this speculation, and without replying he felt amused on a quite different and personal matter. Sergei Ivanovich wound up the last line, untied the horse, and they drove off. Chapter 4. The personal matter that absorbed Levin during his conversation with his brother was this: once in a previous year he had gone to look at the mowing, and being made very angry by the bailiff, he had recourse to his favorite means for regaining his temper. He took a scythe from a peasant and began mowing. He liked the work so much that he had several times tried his hand at mowing since he had cut the whole of the meadow in front of his house. And this year, ever since the early spring, he had cherished a plan for mowing for whole days together with the peasants. Ever since his brother's arrival, he'd been in doubt whether to mow or not. He was loath to leave his brother alone all day long, and he was afraid his brother would laugh at him about it. But as he drove into the meadow and recalled the sensations of mowing, he came near deciding that he would go mowing. After the irritating discussion with his brother, he pondered over his intention again. "I must have physical exercise or my temper will certainly be ruined," he thought, and he determined he would go mowing, however awkward he might feel about it with his brother or the peasants. Towards evening, Konstantin Levin went to his counting house, gave directions as to the work to be done, and sent about the village to summon the mowers for tomorrow to cut the hay in Kalinov meadow, the largest and best of his grasslands, and send my scythe please to Teat for him to set it and bring it round tomorrow. "I shall maybe do some mowing myself," he said, trying not to sound embarrassed. The bailiff smiled and said, "Yes, sir." At tea the same evening, Levin said to his brother, "I fancy the fine weather will last tomorrow. I shall start mowing. I'm so fond of that form of field labor," said Sergei Ivanovich. "I'm awfully fond of it. I sometimes mow myself with the peasants, and tomorrow I want to try mowing the whole day." Sergei Ivanovich lifted his head and looked with interest at his brother. "How do you mean, just like one of the peasants all day long?" "Yes, it's very pleasant," said Levin. "It's splendid as exercise, only you'll hardly be able to stand it," said Sergei Ivanovich without a shade of irony. "I've tried it. It's hard work at first, but you get into it. I dare say I shall manage to keep it up." "Really, what an idea. But tell me, how do the peasants look at it? I suppose they laugh in their sleeves at their masters being such a queer fish." "No, I don't think so. But it's so delightful, and at the same time such hard work that one has no time to think about it. But how will you do about dining with them? To send a bottle of Lafayette and roast turkey out there would be a little awkward. No, I'll simply come home at the time of their noonday rest next morning, Constantine. Levin got up earlier than usual, but he was detained giving directions on the farm, and when he reached the mowing grass, the mowers were already at their second row from the uplands. He could get a view of the shaded cut part of the meadow below, with its grayish ridges of cut grass, and the black heaps of coats taken off by the mowers at the place from which they had started cutting. Gradually, as he rode towards the meadow, the peasants came into sight, some in coats, some in their shirts, mowing one behind another in a long string, swinging their scythes differently. He counted 42 of them. They were mowing slowly over the uneven, low-lying parts of the meadow. Where there had been an old dam, Levin recognized some of his own men. Here was old Yermil in a very long white smock, bending forward to swing a scythe. There was a young fellow, Vaska, who had been a coachman of Levin's, taking every row with a wide sweep. Here, to his teat, Levin's preceptor in the art of mowing a thin little peasant. He was in front of all and cut his wide row without bending, as though playing with the scythe. Levin got off his mare and, fastening her up by the roadside, went to meet Teat, who took a second scythe out of a bush and gave it to him. "It's ready, sir. It's like a razor cuts of itself," said Teat, taking off his cap with a smile and giving him the scythe. Levin took the scythe and began trying it. As they finished their rows, the mowers, hot and good-humored, came out into the road one after another, and laughing a little greeted the master. They all stared at him, but no one made any remark, till a tall old man with a wrinkled, beardless face, wearing a short sheepskin jacket, came out into the road and accosted him. "Looky now, master. Once take hold of the rope, there's no letting go," he said, and Levin heard smothered laughter among the mowers. "I'll try not to let it go," he said, taking his stand behind Teat and waiting for the time to begin. "Mindy," repeated the old man. Teat made room and Levin started behind him. The grass was short close to the road, and Levin, who had not done any mowing for a long time and was disconcerted by the eyes fastened upon him, cut badly for the first moments, though he swung his scythe vigorously. Behind him he heard voices. "It's not set right, handles to high, see how he has to stoop to it," said one. "Press more on the heel," said another. "Never mind, he'll get on all right," the old man resumed. "He's made a start. You swing it too wide, you'll tire yourself out." The master sure does his best for himself, but see, the grass missed out for such work. Us fellows would catch at the grass, became softer, and Levin, listening without answering, followed Teat, trying to do the best he could. They moved 100 paces. Teat kept moving on, without stopping, not showing the slightest weariness, but Levin was already beginning to be afraid he would not be able to keep it up. He was so tired, he felt as he swung his scythe that he was at the very end of his strength, and was making up his mind to ask Teat to stop. But at that very moment Teat stopped of his own accord, and stooping down picked up some grass, rubbed his scythe, and began wetting it. Levin straightened himself and, drawing a deep breath, looked around. Behind him came a peasant, and he too was evidently tired, for he stopped at once without waiting to mow up to Levin and began wedging his scythe. Teat sharpened his scythe and levers, and they went on. The next time it was just the same. Teat moved on with sweep after sweep of his scythes, not stopping nor showing signs of weariness. Levin followed him, trying not to get left behind, and he found it harder and harder. The moment came when he felt he had no strength left, but at that very moment T8 stopped and wetted the scythes, so they mowed the first row, and this long row seemed particularly hard work to Levin. But when the end was reached and he shouldered his scythe, began with deliberate stride, returning on the tracks left by his heels in the cut grass, and Levin walked back in the same way over the space he had cut, in spite of the sweat that ran in streams over his face and fell in drops down his nose and drenched his back as though he had been soaked in water. He felt very happy. What delighted him particularly was that now he knew he would be able to hold out. His pleasure was only disturbed by his row not being well cut. "I will swing less with my arm and more with my whole body," he thought, comparing Tight's row, which looked as if it had been cut with a line, with his own unevenly and irregularly lying grass. The first row, as Levin noticed, Teat had mowed especially quickly, probably wishing to put his master to the test, and the row happened to be a long one. The next rows were easier, but still Levin had to strain every nerve not to drop behind the peasants. He thought of nothing, wished for nothing but not to be left behind the peasants, and to do his work as well as possible he heard nothing but the swish of scythes and saw before him Teet's upright figure moving away the crescent-shaped curve of the cut grass, the grass and flower heads slowly and rhythmically falling before the blade of his scythe, and ahead of him the end of the row, where would come the rest. Suddenly, in the midst of his toil, without understanding what it was or whence it came, he felt a pleasant sensation of chill on his hot moist shoulders. He glanced at the sky in the interval for wetting the sides. A heavy, lowering storm cloud had blown up and big raindrops were falling. Some of the peasants went to their coats and put them on others. Just like Levin himself merely shrugged their shoulders, enjoying the pleasant coolness of it. Another row, and yet another row followed, long rows and short rows with good grass, and with poor grass. Levin lost all sense of time and could not have told whether it was late or early. Now a change began to come over his work which gave him immense satisfaction. In the midst of his toil there were moments during which he forgot what he was doing, and it came all easy to him, and at those moments his row was almost as smooth and well cut as Teet's. But so soon as he recalled what he was doing and began trying to do better, he was at once conscious of all the difficulty of his task, and the row was badly mown. On finishing yet another row he would have gone back to the top of the meadow again to begin the next, but Teth stopped, and going up to the old man, said something in a low voice to him. They both looked at the son. What are they talking about? And why doesn't he go back? Thought Levin, not guessing that the peasants had been mowing no less than 4 hours without stopping, and it was time for their lunch. Lunch, sir, said the old man. Is it really time? That's right, lunch. Then Levin gave his scythe to Tit, and together with the peasants, who were crossing the long stretch of mown grass slightly sprinkled with rain to get their bread from the heap of coats, he went towards his house. Only then he suddenly awoke to the fact that he had been wrong about the weather, and the rain was drenching his hay. The hay will be spoiled, he said. Not a bit of it, sir. Mow in the rain, and you'll rake in fine weather, said the old man. Levin untied his horse and rode home to his coffee. Sergei Ivanovich was only just getting up. When he had drunk his coffee, Levin rode back again to the mowing before Sergei Ivanovich had had time to dress and come down to the dining room. Chapter 5. After lunch, Levin was not in the same place in the string of mowers as before, but stood between the old man who had accosted him jocosely and now invited him to be his neighbor, and a young peasant who had only been married in the autumn and who was mowing this summer for the first time. The old man, holding himself erect, moved in front with his feet turned out, taking long regular strides, and with a precise and regular action which seemed to cost him no more effort than swinging one's arms and walking as though it were in play. He laid down the high even row of grass. It was as though it were not he, but the sharp scythe of itself swishing through the juicy grass. Behind Levin came the lad Mishka. His pretty boyish face with a twist of fresh grass bound round his hair was all working with effort, but whenever anyone looked at him he smiled. He would clearly have died sooner than own it was hard work for him. Levin kept between them. In the very heat of the day, the mowing did not seem such hard work to him. The perspiration with which he was drenched cooled him, while the sun that burned his back, his head, and his arms bare to the elbow gave a vigor and dogged energy to his labor. And more often now came those moments of unconsciousness when it was possible not to think what one was doing. The scythe cut of itself. These were happy moments. Still more delightful were the moments when they reached the stream where the rows ended, and the old man rubbed his side with the wet thick grass, rinsed its blade in the fresh water of the stream, ladled out a little in a tin dipper, and offered Levin a drink. What do you say to my home brew? A good, said he, winking, and truly Levin had never drunk any liquor so good as this warm water with green bits floating in it and a taste of rust from the tin dipper. And immediately after this came the delicious slow saunter with his hand on the scythe, during which he could wipe away the steaming sweat, take deep breaths of air, and look about at the long string of mowers and at what was happening around in the forest and the country. The longer Levin mowed, the oftener he felt the moments of unconsciousness in which it seemed not his hands that swung the scythe, but the scythe mowing of itself, a body full of life and consciousness of its own, and as though by magic, without thinking of it, the work turned out regular and well finished of itself. These were the most blissful moments. It was only hard work when he had to break off the motion which had become unconscious, and to think, when he had to mow around a hillock or a tuft of sorrel, the old man did this easily. When a hillock came, he changed his action, and at one time with the heel, and at another with the tip of his scythe clipped the hillock round both sides, with short strokes. And while he did this, he kept looking about, and watching what came into his view. At one moment he picked a wild berry, and ate it or offered it to Levin. Then he flung away a twig with a blade of the scythe. Then he looked at a quail's nest from which the bird flew just under the scythe, or caught a snake that crossed his path, and lifting it on the scythe, as though on a fork, showed it to Levin, and threw it away for both Levin and the young peasant behind him. Such changes of position were difficult, both of them repeating over and over again the same strained movement, were in a perfect frenzy of toil, and were incapable of shifting their position, and at the same time watching what was before them. Levin did not notice how time was passing. If he had been asked how long he'd been working, he would have said half an hour, and it was getting on for dinner time. As they were walking back over the cut grass, the old man called Levin's attention to the little girls and boys who are coming from different directions, hardly visible through the long grass, and along the road towards the mowers, carrying sacks of bread, dragging at their little hands, and pitchers of the sour rye beer, with cloths wrapped around them. "Looky, the little emmets crawling," he said, pointing to them, and he shaded his eyes with his hand to look at the sun. "They mowed 2 more rows." The old man stopped. "Come, master, dinner time," he said briskly, and on reaching the stream, the mowers moved off across the lines of cut grass towards their pile of coats, where the children who'd brought their dinner were sitting waiting for. Then the peasants gathered into groups, those further away under a cart, those nearer under a willow bush. Levin sat down by them. He felt disinclined to go away. All constraint with the master had disappeared long ago. The peasants got ready for dinner. Some washed the young lads, bathed in the stream. Others made a place comfortable for a rest, untied their sacks of bread, and uncovered the pitchers of rye beer. The old man crumbled up some bread in a cup, stirred it with the handle of a spoon, poured water on it from the dipper, broke up some more bread, and having seasoned it with salt, he turned to the east to say his prayer. "Come, master, taste my sop," said he, kneeling before the cup. The sop was so good that Levin gave up the idea of going home. He dined with the old man and talked to him about his family affairs, taking the keenest interest in them, and told him about his own affairs and all the circumstances that could be of interest to the old man. He felt much nearer to him than to his brother, and could not help smiling at the affection he felt for this man. When the man got up again, said his prayer, and lay down under a bush, putting some grass under his head for a pillow, Levin did the same, and in spite of the clinging flies that were so persistent in the sunshine, and the midges that tickled his hot face and body, he fell asleep at once, and only woke when the sun had passed to the other side of the bush and reached him. The old man had been awake a long while, and was sitting up, wetting the sides of the younger lads. Levin looked about him and hardly recognized the place. Everything was so changed. The immense stretch of meadow had been mown, and was sparkling with a peculiar fresh brilliance, with its lines of already sweet-smelling grass in the slanting rays of the evening sun, and the bushes about the river had been cut down, and the river itself not visible before, now gleaming like steel in its bends, and the moving ascending peasants, and the sharp wall of grass of the unknown part of the meadow, and the hawks hovering over the stripped meadow. All was perfectly new. Raising himself, Levin began considering how much had been cut, and how much more could still be done that day. The work done was exceptionally much for 42 men. They had cut the whole of the big meadow, which had in the years of serf labor taken 30 scythes 2 days to mow. Only the corners remained to do where the rows were short, but Levin felt a longing to get as much mowing done that day as possible, and was vexed with the sun sinking so quickly in the sky. He felt no weariness. All he wanted was to get his work done more and more quickly, and as much done as possible. "Could you cut Mashkin upland to what do you think?" he said to the old man. "As God wills, the sun's not high. A little vodka for the lads at the afternoon rest." When they were sitting down again, and those who smoked had lighted their pipes, the old man told the men that Mashkin's upland to be cut. "There'll be some vodka. Why not cut it? Come on, Teet, we'll look sharp. We can eat at night." "Come on," cried voices, and eating up their bread, the mowers went back to work. "Come, lads, keep it up," said Teet, and ran on ahead almost at a trot. Get along," said the old man hurrying after him and easily overtaking him. "I'll mow you down, look out," and young and old mowed away as though they were racing with one another. But however fast they worked, they did not spoil the grass, and the rows were laid just as neatly, and exactly the little piece left uncut in the corner was mown in 5 minutes. The last of the mowers were just ending their rows while the foremost snatched up their coats onto their shoulders and crossed the road towards Mashkin. Upland, the sun was already sinking into the trees when they went with their jingling dippers into the wooded ravine of Mashkin Upland. The grass was up to their waists in the middle of the hollow, soft, tender, and feathery, spotted here and there among the trees with Wild Heart's ease. After a brief consultation whether to take the rows lengthwise or diagonally, Prior Milan, also a renowned mower, a huge black-haired peasant, went on ahead. He went up to the top, turned back again, and started mowing, and they all proceeded to form in line behind him. Going downhill through the hollow and uphill right up to the edge of the forest, the sun sank behind the forest. The dew was falling by now. The mowers were in the sun only on the hillside, but below where a mist was rising, and on the opposite side they mowed into the fresh dewy shade. The work went rapidly. The grass cut with a juicy sound and was at once laid in high fragrant rows. The mowers from all sides brought closer together in the short row, kept urging one another on to the sound of jingling dippers and clanging scythes, and the hiss of the wet stone sharpening them, and good-humored shouts. Levin still kept between the young peasant and the old man who'd put on his short sheepskin jacket was just as good-humored, jocose, and free in his movements among the trees. They were continually cutting with their scythes the so-called birch mushrooms, swollen fat, and the succulent grass. But the old man bent down every time he came across a mushroom, picked it up, and put it in his bosom. "Another present for my old woman," he said as he did so, easy as it was to mow the wet, soft grass. It was hard work going up and down the steep sides of the ravine, but this did not trouble the old man, swinging his scythe just as ever and moving his feet in their big plated shoes. With firm little steps he climbed slowly up the steep place, and though his breeches hanging out below his smock and his whole frame trembled with effort, he did not miss one blade of grass or one mushroom on his way, and kept making jokes with the peasants and Levin. Levin walked after him and often thought he must fall as he climbed with a scythe up a steep cliff where it would have been hard work to clamber without anything. But he climbed up and did what he had to do. He felt as though some external force were moving him. Chapter 6. Mashkin Upland was mown. The last row finished. The peasants had put on their coats and were gaily trudging home. Levin got on his horse and, parting regretfully from the peasants, rode homewards on the hillside. He looked back. He could not see them in the mist that had risen from the valley. He could only hear rough, good-humored voices, laughter, and the sound of clanking scythes. Sergei Ivanovich had long ago finished dinner and was drinking iced lemon and water in his own room, looking through the reviews and papers which he'd only just received by post, when Levin rushed into the room, talking merrily with his wet and matted hair sticking to his forehead and his back and chest grimed and moist. "We mowed the whole meadow. Oh, it is nice, delicious. And how have you been getting on?" said Levin, completely forgetting the disagreeable conversation of the previous day. "Mercy, what do you look like?" said Sergei Ivanovich for the first time, looking around with some dissatisfaction. "And the door, do shut the door," he cried. "You must have let in a dozen at least." Sergei Ivanovich could not endure flies, and in his own room he never opened the window except at night, and carefully kept the door shut. "Not one, on my honor. But if I have, I'll catch them. You wouldn't believe what a pleasure it is. How have you spent the day?" "Very well. But have you really been mowing the whole day? I expect you're as hungry as a wolf. Kuzma's got everything ready for you." "No, I don't feel hungry. Even I had something to eat there. But I'll go and wash." "Yes, go along, and I'll come to you directly," said Sergei Ivanovich, shaking his head as he looked at his brother. "Go along, make haste," he added, smiling, and gathering up his books, he prepared to go too. He felt suddenly good-humored and disinclined to leave his brother's side. "But what did you do while it was raining?" "Rain, white. There was scarcely a drop." "I'll come directly." "So you had a nice day too. That's first rate." And Levin went off to change his clothes. 5 minutes later the brothers met in the dining room. Although it seemed to Levin that he was not hungry, and he sat down to dinner simply so as not to hurt Klusma's feelings. Yet when he began to eat, the dinner struck him as extraordinarily good. Sergei Ivanovich watched him with a smile. "Oh, by the way, there's a letter for you," said he. "Kuzma, bring it down, please. And mind you shut the doors." The letter was from Oblonsky. Levin read it aloud. Oblonsky wrote to him from Petersburg. "I have had a letter from Dolly. She's at Ergushevovo, and everything seems to be going wrong there. Do ride over and see her. Please help her with advice. You know all about it. She'd be so glad to see you. She's quite alone, poor thing. My mother-in-law and all of them are still abroad. That's capital. I will certainly ride over to her," said Levin, "or we'll go together. She's such a splendid woman, isn't she? They're not far from here than 25 miles, or perhaps 30, but a capital road. Capital will drive over. I shall be delighted," said Sergei Ivanovich, still smiling. The sight of his younger brother's appearance had immediately put him in a good humor. "Will you have an appetite?" he said, looking at his dark red sunburned face and neck bent over the plate. "Splendid. You can't imagine what an effectual remedy it is for every sort of foolishness. I want to enrich medicine with a new word, Arbeitsker. Well, but you don't need it, I should fancy. No, but for all sorts of nervous invalids, yes. It ought to be tried. I had meant to come to the mowing to look at you, but it was so unbearably hot that I got no further than the forest. I sat there a little and went on by the forest to the village, met your old nurse, and sounded her as to the peasants' view of you. As far as I can make out, they don't approve of this," she said. "It's not a gentleman's work altogether. I fancy that in the people's ideas there are very clear and definite notions of certain, as they call it, gentlemanly lines of action, and they don't sanction the gentry moving outside bounds clearly laid down. In their ideas maybe so, but anyway it's a pleasure such as I have never known in my life, and there's no harm in it, you know, is there?" answered Levin. "I can't help it if they don't like it, though I do believe it's all right." "Hey, altogether," pursued Sergei Ivanovich, "you're satisfied with your day?" "Quite satisfied. We cut the whole meadow, and such a splendid old man I made friends with there. You can't fancy how delightful he was." "Well, so you're content with your day?" "And so am I. First I solved 2 chess problems, and won a very pretty one. Upon opening, I'll show you. And then I thought over our conversation yesterday." "Our conversation yesterday," said Levin blissfully, dropping his eyelids and drawing deep breaths after finishing his dinner, and absolutely incapable of recalling what their conversation yesterday was about. "I think you are partly right. Our difference of opinion amounts to this, that you make the mainspring self-interest, while I suppose that interest in the common weal is bound to exist in every man of a certain degree of advancement. Possibly you're right too, that action founded on material interest would be more desirable. You are altogether, as the French say, tout premier sur in nature. You must have intense energetic action or nothing." Levin listened to his brother and did not understand a single word, and did not want to understand. He was only afraid his brother might ask him some question which would make it evident he had not heard. "So that's what I think it is, my dear boy," said Sergei Ivanovich, touching him on the shoulder. "Yes, of course, but you know I won't stand up for my view," answered Levin with a guilty childlike smile. "Whatever was it I was disputing about?" he wondered. "Of course I'm right, and he's right, and it's all first-rate, only I must go round to the counting house and see to things." He got up, stretching and smiling. Sergei Ivanovich smiled too. "If you want to go out, let's go together," he said, disinclined to be parted from his brother, who seemed positively breathing out freshness and energy. "Come, we'll go to the counting house, if you have to go there." "Oh heavens!" shouted Levin so loudly that Sergei Ivanovich was quite frightened. What's the matter?" "How's Agafia Mikhailovna's hand?" said Levin, slapping himself on the head. "I'd positively forgotten her even. It's much better. Well, anyway, I'll run down to her before you've time to get your hat on. I'll be back." And he ran downstairs, clattering with his heels like a spring rattle. Chapter 7. Stepan Arkadyevich had gone to Petersburg to perform the most natural and essential official duty, so familiar to everyone in the government service, though incomprehensible to outsiders, that duty, but for which one could hardly be in government service, of reminding the ministry of his existence. And having, for the due performance of this rite, taken all the available cash from home, was gaily and agreeably spending his days at the races and in the summer villas, while Dolly and the children had moved into the country. To cut down expenses as much as possible, she had gone to Ergozovo, the estate that had been her dowry, and the one where in the spring the forest had been sold. It was nearly 40 Miles from Levinsk-Pokrovskoe, the big old house at Urgazovo had been pulled down long ago, and the old prince had had the lodge done up and built onto 20 years before. When Dolly was a child, the lodge had been roomy and comfortable, though like all lodges it stood sideways to the entrance avenue and faced the south. But by now this lodge was old and dilapidated. When Stepan Arkadyevich had gone down in the spring to sell the forest, Dolly had begged him to look over the house and order what repairs might be needed. Stepan Arkadyevich, like all unfaithful husbands indeed, was very solicitous for his wife's comfort, and he had himself looked over the house and given instructions about everything that he considered necessary. What he considered necessary was to cover all the furniture with cretonne, to put up curtains, to weed the garden, to make a little bridge on the pond, and to plant flowers. But he forgot many other essential matters, the want of which greatly distressed Darya Alexandrovna later on. In spite of Stepan Arkadyevich's efforts to be an attentive father and husband, he never could keep in his mind that he had a wife and children. He had bachelor tastes, and it was in accordance with them that he shaped his life. On his return to Moscow, he informed his wife with pride that everything was ready, that the house would be a little paradise, and that he advised her most certainly to go. His wife staying away in the country was very agreeable to Stepan Arkadyev from every point of view. It did the children good, it decreased expenses, and it left him more at liberty. Darya Alexandrovna regarded staying in the country for the summer as essential for the children, especially for the little girl who had not succeeded in regaining her strength after the scarlatina, and also as a means of escaping the petty humiliations, the little bills owing to the wood merchant, the fishmonger, the shoemaker, which made her miserable. Besides this, she was pleased to go away to the country because she was dreaming of getting her sister Kitty to stay there with her. Kitty was to be back from abroad in the middle of the summer, and bathing had been prescribed for her. Kitty wrote that no prospect was so alluring as to spend the summer with Dolly at Urgazovo, full of childish associations. For both of them, the first days of her existence in the country were very hard. For Dolly, she used to stay in the country as a child, and the impression she'd retained of it was that the country was a refuge from all the unpleasantness of the town, that life there, though not luxurious, Dolly could easily make up her mind to that was cheap and comfortable, that there was plenty of everything. Everything was cheap, everything could be got, and children were happy. But now, coming to the country as the head of a family, she perceived that it was all utterly unlike what she had fancied the day after their arrival. There was a heavy fall of rain, and in the night the water came through in the corridor and in the nursery, so that the beds had to be carried into the drawing room. There was no kitchen maid to be found. Of the 9 cows, it appeared from the words of the cowherd woman that some were about to calve, others had just calved, others were old, and others again hard uddered. There was not butter nor milk enough even for the children. There were no eggs, they could get no fowls. Old purplish stringy cocks were all they had for roasting, and boiling impossible to get women to scrub the floors. All were potato hoeing. Driving was out of the question because one of the horses was restive and bolted in the shafts. There was no place where they could bathe. The whole of the river bank was trampled by the cattle and open to the road. Even walks were impossible for the cattle. Straight into the garden through a gap in the hedge, and there was one terrible bull who bellowed and therefore might be expected to gore somebody. There were no proper cupboards for their clothes. What cupboards there were either would not close at all or burst open whenever anyone passed by them. There were no pots and pans. There was no copper in the washhouse, nor even an ironing board in the maid's room. Finding, instead of peace and rest, all these from her point of view fearful calamities, Darya Alexandrovna was at first in despair. She exerted herself to the utmost, felt the hopelessness of the position, and was every instant suppressing the tears that started into her eyes. The bailiff, a retired quartermaster whom Stepan Arkadyevich had taken a fancy to and had appointed bailiff on account of his handsome and respectful appearance as a hall porter, showed no sympathy for Darya Alexandrovna's woes. He said respectfully, "Nothing can be done, the peasants are such a wretched lot," and did nothing to help her. The position seemed hopeless, but in the Oblonsky household, as in all families indeed, there was one inconspicuous but most valuable and useful person Maria Philimonovna, she soothed her mistress, assured her that everything would come round. It was her expression, and Madame had borrowed it from her, and without fuss or hurry, proceeded to set to work herself. She had immediately made friends with the bailiff's wife, and on the first day she drank tea with her and the bailiff under the acacias, and reviewed all the circumstances of the position. Very soon Maria Filipovna had established her club, so to say, under the acacias, and there it was in this club, consisting of the bailiff's wife, the village elder, and the counting house clerk, that the difficulties of existence were gradually smoothed away, and in a week's time everything actually had come round the roof. Was mended, a kitchen maid was found, a crony of the village elders, hens were bought, the cows began giving milk, the garden hedge was stopped up with stakes, the carpenter made a mangle, hooks were put in the cupboards, and they ceased to burst open. Simultaneously, and an ironing board covered with army cloth was placed across from the arm of a chair to the chest of drawers, and there was a smell of flat irons in the maid's room. Just see now, and you are quite in despair, said Maria Philimonovna, pointing to the ironing board. They even rigged up a bathing shed of straw hurdles. Lily began to bathe, and Daria Alexandrovna began to realize, if only in part, her expectations, if not of a peaceful, at least of a comfortable life in the country. Peaceful with 6 children, Daria Alexandrovna could not be. One would fall ill, another might easily become so, a third would be without something necessary, a fourth would show symptoms of a bad disposition, and so on. Rare indeed were the brief periods of peace, but these cares and anxieties were for Daria Alexandrovna the sole happiness possible. Had it not been for them, she would have been left alone to brood over her husband, who did not love her, and besides, hard though it was for the mother to bear the dread of illness, the illnesses themselves, and the grief of seeing signs of evil propensities in her children. The children themselves were even now repaying her in small joys for her sufferings. Those joys were so small that they passed unnoticed like gold in sand, and at bad moments she could see nothing but the pain, nothing but sand. But there were good moments too, when she saw nothing but the joy, nothing but gold. Now in the solitude of the country she began to be more and more frequently aware of those joys. Often looking at them, she would make every possible effort to persuade herself that she was mistaken, that she as a mother was partial to her children. All the same, she could not help saying to herself that she had charming children, all 6 of them in different ways, but a set of children such as is not often to be met with, and she was happy in them and proud of them. Chapter 8. Towards the end of May, when everything had been more or less satisfactorily arranged, she received her husband's answer to her complaints of the disorganized state of things in the country. He wrote begging her forgiveness for not having thought of everything before, and promised to come down at the first chance. This chance did not present itself until the beginning of June. Daria Alexandrovna stayed alone in the country. On the Sunday in St. Peter's week, Daria Alexandrovna drove to Mass for all her children to take the sacrament. Daria Alexandrovna, in her intimate philosophical talks with her sister, her mother, and her friends, very often astonished them by the freedom of her views in regard to religion. She had a strange religion of transmigration of souls, all her own, in which she had firm faith, troubling herself little about the dogmas of the Church. But in her family she was strict in carrying out all that was required by the Church, and not merely in order to set an example, but with all her heart in it. The fact that the children had not been at the sacrament for nearly a year worried her extremely, and with the full approval and sympathy of Maria Philimonovna, she decided that this should take place now in the summer. For several days before, Daria Alexandrovna was busily deliberating on how to dress all the children. Frocks were made or altered, and washed, seams and flounces were let out, buttons were sewn on, and ribbons got ready. One dress, Tanya's, which the English governess had undertaken, caused Daria Alexandrovna much loss of temper. The English governess, in altering it, had made the seams in the wrong place, had taken up the sleeves too much, and altogether spoiled the dress. It was so narrow on Tanya's shoulders that it was quite painful to look at her. But Maria Philimonovna had the happy thought of putting in gussets and adding a little shoulder cape. The dress was set right, but there was nearly a quarrel with the English governess on the morning. However, all was happily arranged, and towards 10 o'clock, the time at which they had asked the priest to wait for them for the Mass, the children in their new dresses with beaming faces stood on the step before the carriage waiting for their mother to the carriage instead of the restive raven they had harnessed, thanks to the representations of Maria Philimonovna, the bailiff's horse Brownie, and Darya Alexandrovna, delayed by anxiety over her own attire, came out and got dressed in a white muslin gown. Darya Alexandrovna had done her hair, and, dressed with care and excitement in the old days, she dressed of her own sake to look pretty and be admired later on. As she got older, dress became more and more distasteful to her. She saw that she was losing her good looks, but now she began to feel pleasure and interest in dress again. Now she did not dress for her own sake, not for the sake of her own beauty, but simply that as the mother of those exquisite creatures, she might not spoil the general effect. And looking at herself for the last time in the looking glass, she was satisfied with herself. She looked nice, not nice as she would have wished to look nice in old days at a ball, but nice for the object which she now had in view in the church. There was no one but the peasants, the servants, and their women folk. But Darya Alexandrovna saw, or fancied she saw, the sensation produced by her children in her. The children were not only beautiful to look at in their smart little dresses, but they were charming in the way they behaved. Alyosha, it is true, did not stand quite correctly. He kept turning round trying to look at his little jacket from behind, but all the same he was wonderfully sweet. Tanya behaved like a grown-up person and looked after the little ones, and the smallest Lily was bewitching in her naive astonishment at everything, and it was difficult not to smile when, after taking the sacrament, she said in English, "Please, some more." On the way home, the children felt that something solemn had happened and were very sedate. Everything went happily at home too. But at lunch Grisha began whistling, and what was worse, was disobedient to the English governess and was forbidden to have any tart. Darya Alexandrovna would not have let things go so far on such a day had she been present, but she had to support the English governess's authority, and she upheld her decision that Greta should have no tart. This rather spoiled the general good humor. Grisha cried, declaring that Nikolinka had whistled too and he was not punished, and that he wasn't crying for the tart, he didn't care. But it being unjustly treated, this was really too tragic, and Darya Alexandrovna made up her mind to persuade the English governess to forgive Grisha, and she went to speak to her. But on the way, as she passed the drawing room, she beheld a scene filling her heart with such pleasure that the tears came into her eyes, and she forgave the delinquent herself. The culprit was sitting at the window in the corner of the drawing room. Beside him was standing Tanya with a plate on the pretext of wanting to give some dinner to her dolls. She had asked the governess's permission to take her share of tart to the nursery, and had taken it instead to her brother while still weeping over the injustice of his punishment. He was eating the tart and kept saying through his sobs, "Eat yourself, let's eat it together." Tanya had at first been under the influence of her pity for Grisha, then of a sense of her noble action, and tears were standing in her eyes too, but she did not refuse and ate her share. On catching sight of their mother, they were dismayed, but looking into her face they saw they were not doing wrong. They burst out laughing, and with their mouths full of tart they began wiping their smiling lips with their hands and smearing their radiant faces all over with tears and jam. "Mercy, your new white frock, Tanya," Grisha said, their mother trying to save the frock, but with tears in her eyes, smiling a blissful, rapturous smile. The new frocks were taken off, and orders were given for the little girls to have their blouses put on, and the boys their old jackets, and the wagonette to be harnessed with Brownie, to the bailiff's annoyance again, and the shafts to drive out for mushroom picking and bathing. A roar of delighted shrieks arose in the nursery and never ceased till they had set off for the bathing place. They gathered a whole basket full of mushrooms. Even Lily found a birch mushroom. It had always happened before that Miss Hool found them and pointed them out to her, but this time she found a big one quite of herself, and there was a general scream of delight. "Lily has found a mushroom." Then they reached the river, put the horses under the birch trees, and went to the bathing place. The coachman Terenti fastened the horses, who kept whisking away the flies, to a tree, and treading down the grass, lay down in the shade of a birch and smoked his shag, while the never-ceasing shrieks of delight of the children floated across to him from the bathing place. Though it was hard work to look after all the children and restrain their wild pranks, though it was difficult to keep in one's head and not mix up all the stockings, little breeches, and shoes for the different legs, and to undo and to do up again all the tapes and buttons. Daria Alexandrovna, who had always liked bathing herself and believed it to be very good for the children, enjoyed nothing so much as bathing with all the children, to go over all those fat little legs, pulling on their stockings, to take in her arms and dip those little naked bodies, and to hear their screams of delight and alarm, to see the breathless faces with wide open, scared and happy eyes of all her splashing cherubs, was a great pleasure to her. When half the children had been dressed, some peasant women in holiday dress out picking herbs came up to the bathing shed and stopped shyly. Maria Philimonovna called one of them and handed her a sheet and a shirt that had dropped into the water for her to dry them, and Daria Alexandrovna began to talk to the women. At first they laughed behind their hands and did not understand her questions, but soon they grew bolder and began to talk, winning Daria Alexandrovna's heart at once by the genuine admiration of the children that they showed. My, what a beauty, as white as sugar, said one admiring Tanechka, and shaking her head. But thin, yes, she's been ill, and so they've been bathing you to, said another to the baby. No, he's only 3 months old, answered Daria Alexandrovna with pride. You don't say so. And have you any children? I've had 4. I've 2 living, a boy and a girl. I weaned her last carnival. How old is she? Why, 2 years old. Why did you nurse her so long? It's our custom for 3 fasts. And the conversation became most interesting to Daria Alexandrovna. What sort of time did she have? What was the matter with the boy? Where was her husband? Did it often happen? Daria Alexandrovna felt disinclined to leave the peasant women. So interesting to her was their conversation, so completely identical were all their interests. What pleased her most of all was that she saw clearly what all the women admired more than anything else was her having so many children, and such fine ones. The peasant women even made Daria Alexandrovna laugh, and offended the English governess because she was the cause of the laughter. She did not understand. One of the younger women kept staring at the English woman, who was dressing after all the rest, and when she put on her 3rd petticoat she could not refrain from the remark, my, she keeps putting on, and she never have done, she said. And they all went off into roars. Chapter 9. On the drive home, as Daria Alexandrovna, with all her children round her, their heads still wet from their bath and a kerchief tied over her own head, was getting near the house, the coachman said, there's some gentleman coming, the master of Pachekovsko. I do believe. Daria Alexandrovna peeped out in front and was delighted when she recognized in the gray hat and gray coat the familiar figure of Levin walking to meet them. She was glad to see him at any time, but at this moment she was especially glad he should see her in all her glory. No one was better able to appreciate her grandeur than Levin. Seeing her, he found himself face to face with one of the pictures of his daydream of family life. You're like a hen with your chickens, Daria Alexandrovna. Oh, how glad I am to see you, she said, holding out her hand to him. Glad to see me, but you didn't let me know. My brother's staying with me. I got a note from Stiva that you were here. From Stiva? Daria Alexandrovna asked with surprise. Yes, he writes that you are here, and that he thinks you might allow me to be of use to you, said Levin. And as he said it, he became suddenly embarrassed, and stopping abruptly, he walked on in silence by the wagonette, snapping off the buds of the lime trees and nipping them. He was embarrassed through a sense that Daria Alexandrovna would be annoyed by receiving from an outsider help that should by rights have come from her own husband. Daria Alexandrovna certainly did not like this little way of stepping on her Kognoviches, of foisting his domestic duties on others, and she was at once aware that Levin was aware of this. It was just for this fineness of perception, for this delicacy, that Daria Alexandrovna liked Levin. I know, of course, said Levin, that simply means that you would like to see me, and I'm exceedingly glad, though I can fancy that used to town housekeeping as you are, you must feel in the wilds here, and if there's anything wanted, I'm altogether at your disposal. Oh no, said Dolly, at first things were rather uncomfortable, but now we've settled everything capitally, thanks to my old nurse, she said, indicating Maria Philimonovna, who, seeing that they were speaking of her, smiled brightly and cordially. Levin, she knew him and knew that he would be a good match for her young lady, and was very keen to see the matter settled. Won't you get in, sir? We'll make room this side, she said to him. No, I'll walk. Children who'd like to race the horses with me. The children knew Levin very little and could not remember when they had seen him, but they experienced in regard to him none of that strange feeling of shyness and hostility which children so often experience towards hypocritical grown-up people, and for which they are so often and miserably punished. Hypocrisy in anything whatever may deceive the cleverest and most penetrating man, but the least wide awake of children recognizes it and is revolted by it. However ingeniously it may be disguised, whatever faults Levin had, there was not a trace of hypocrisy in him, and so the children showed him the same friendliness that they saw on their mother's face on his invitation. The two elder ones at once jumped out to him and ran with him as simply as they would have done with their nurse or Miss Hoole or their mother Lily, to began begging to go to him, and her mother handed her to him. He sat her on his shoulder and ran along with her. "Don't be afraid. Don't be afraid, Darya Alexandrovna," he said, smiling good-humoredly to the mother. "There's no chance of my hurting or dropping her." And looking at his strong, agile, assiduously careful, and needlessly wary movements, the mother felt her mind at rest and smiled gaily and approvingly as she watched him here in the country with children, and with Darya Alexandrovna, with whom he was in sympathy. Levin was in a mood not infrequent with him of childlike lightheartedness that she particularly liked. In him, as he ran with the children, he taught them gymnastic feats, set Miss Hoole laughing with his queer English accent, and talked to Darya Alexandrovna of his pursuits in the country. After dinner, Darya Alexandrovna, sitting alone with him on the balcony, began to speak of Kitty. "You know, Kitty's coming here and is going to spend the summer with me." "Really?" he said, flushing, and at once to change the conversation, he said, "Then I'll send you to cows, shall I? If you insist on a bill, you shall pay me 5 rubles a month. But it's really too bad of you." "No thank you, we can manage very well now." "Oh well, then I'll have a look at your cows, and if you'll allow me, I'll give directions about their food." "Everything depends on their food." And Levin, to turn the conversation, explained to Darya Alexandrovna the theory of cow keeping, based on the principle that the cow is simply a machine for the transformation of food into milk, and so on. He talked of this and passionately longed to hear more of Kitty, and at the same time was afraid of hearing it. He dreaded the breaking up of the inward peace he had gained with such effort. "Yes, but still all this has to be looked after." "And who is there to look after it?" Darya Alexandrovna responded without interest. She had by now got her household matters so satisfactorily arranged, thanks to Maria Philimonovna, that she was disinclined to make any changes in them. Besides, she had no faith in Levin's knowledge of farming general principles. As to the cow being a machine for the production of milk, she looked on with suspicion. It seemed to her that such principles could only be a hindrance in farm management. It all seemed to her a far simpler matter. All that was needed, as Maria Philimonovna had explained, was to give Brindle and White Breast more food and drink, and not to let the cook carry all the kitchen slops to the laundress. Cow, that was clear, but general propositions as to feeding on meal and on grass were doubtful and obscure, and what was most important, she wanted to talk about Kitty. Chapter 10. Kitty writes to me that there's nothing she longs for so much as quiet and solitude, Dolly said after the silence that had followed. "And how is she better?" Levin asked in agitation. "Thank God, she's quite well again. I never believed her lungs were affected." "Oh, I'm very glad," said Levin, and Dolly fancied she saw something touching helpless in his face as he said this, and looked silently into her face. "Let me ask you, Konstantin Dmitrievich," said Darya Alexandrovna, smiling her kindly and rather mocking smile, "why is it you are angry with Kitty?" "I'm not angry with her," said Levin. "Yes, you are angry. Why is it you did not come to see us nor them when you were in Moscow?" "Darya Alexandrovna," he said, blushing up to the roots of his hair, "I wonder really that with your kind heart you don't feel this. How is it you feel no pity for me, if nothing else, when you know—" "What do I know?" "You know I made an offer, and that I was refused," said Levin, and all the tenderness he had been feeling for Kitty a minute before was replaced by a feeling of anger for the slight he had suffered. "What makes you suppose I know?" "Because everybody knows it. That's just where you're mistaken. I did not know it, though I had guessed it was so well. Now you know it. All I knew was that something had happened that made her dreadfully miserable, and that she begged me never to speak of it, and if she would not tell me, she would certainly not speak of it to anyone else." "But what did pass between you? Tell me." "I have told you." "When was it?" "When I was at their house last time." "Do you know that?" said Darya Alexandrovna. "I am awfully, awfully sorry for her. You suffer only from pride, perhaps." "So," said Levin, but she interrupted him. "But she, poor girl, I'm awfully sorry for her now. I see it all well, Daria Alexandrovna. You must excuse me," he said, getting up. "Goodbye, Daria Alexandrovna. Till we meet again." "No, wait a minute," she said, clutching him by the sleeve. "Wait a minute, sit down, please, don't let us talk of this," he said, sitting down, and at the same time feeling rise up and stir within his heart a hope he had believed to be buried. "If I did not like you," she said, and tears came into her eyes. "If I did not know you as I do know you," the feeling that had seemed dead revived more and more, rose up, and took possession of Levin's heart. "Yes, I understand it all now," said Daria Alexandrovna. "You can't understand it for you. Men who are free and make your own choice, it's always clear whom you love. But a girl's in a position of suspense. With all a woman's or maiden's modesty, a girl who sees you men from afar, who takes everything on trust, a girl may have and often has such a feeling that she cannot tell what to say. Yes, if the heart does not speak, no, the heart does speak. But just consider, you men have views about a girl. You come to the house, you make friends, you criticize, you wait to see if you've found what you love. And then when you're sure you love her, you make an offer. Well, that's not quite it anyway. You make an offer when your love is ripe, or when the balance has completely turned between the two you're choosing from. But a girl is not asked, she's expected to make her choice, and yet she cannot choose. She can only answer yes or no. Yes, to choose between me and Vronsky, thought Levin, and the dead thing that had come to life within him died again and only weighed on his heart and set it aching. "Daria Alexandrovna," he said, "that's how one chooses a new dress or some purchase or other. Not love. The choice has been made, and so much the better. And there can be no repeating it." Pride, said Daria Alexandrovna, as though despising him for the baseness of this feeling in comparison with that other feeling, which only women know at the time when you made Kitty an offer. She was just in a position in which she could not answer. She was in doubt between you and Vronsky, him she was seeing every day, and you she had not seen for a long while. Supposing she'd been older, I, for instance, in her place, could have felt no doubt. I always disliked him. And so it has turned out. Levin recalled Kitty's answer. She had said, "No, that cannot be, Daria Alexandrovna," he said dryly. "I appreciate your confidence in me. I believe you are making a mistake. But whether I am right or wrong, that pride you so despise makes any thought of Katerina Alexandrovna out of the question for me. You understand, utterly out of the question. I will only say one thing more. You know that I'm speaking of my sister, whom I love as I love my own children. I don't say she cared for you. All I meant to say is that her refusal at that moment proves nothing." "I don't know," said Levin, jumping up. "If you only knew how you're hurting me. It's just as if a child of yours were dead, and they were to say to you he would have been like this and like that, and he might have lived, and how happy you would have been in him. But he's dead, dead. How absurd you are," said Daria Alexandrovna, looking with mournful tenderness at Levin's excitement. "Yes, I see it all more and more clearly," she went on musingly. "So you won't come to see us then when Kitty's here?" "No, I shan't come. Of course I won't avoid meeting Katerina Alexandrovna as far as I can. I will try to save her the annoyance of my presence." "You are very absurd," repeated Daria Alexandrovna, looking with tenderness into his face. "Very well. Then let it be as though we have not spoken of this. What have you come for?" "Tanya," she said in French to the little girl who had come in. "Where's my spade?" "Mama, I speak French, and you must." The little girl tried to say it in French, but could not remember the French for spade. The mother prompted her, and then told her in French where to look for the spade, and this made a disagreeable impression on Levin. Everything in Daria Alexandrovna's house and children struck him now as by no means so charming as a little while before. And what does she talk French with the children? For he thought how unnatural and false it is, and the children feel it so. Learning French and unlearning sincerity, he thought to himself, unaware that Daria Alexandrovna had thought all that over 20 times already, and yet even at the cost of some loss of sincerity, believed it necessary to teach her children French in that way. "But why are you going? Do stay a little." Levin stayed to tea, but his good humor had vanished, and he felt ill at ease. After tea he went out into the hall to order his horses to be put in, and when he came back, he found Daria Alexandrovna greatly disturbed, with a troubled face and tears in her eyes. While Levin had been outside, an incident had occurred which had utterly shattered all the happiness she'd been feeling that day, and her pride in the children Grisha and Tanya had been fighting over a ball. Darya Alexandrovna, hearing a scream in the nursery, ran in and saw a terrible sight. Tanya was pulling Grisha's hair while he, with a face hideous with rage, was beating her with his fists. Wherever he could get at her, something snapped in Darya Alexandrovna's heart. When she saw this, it was as if darkness had swooped down upon her life. She felt that these children of hers that she was so proud of were not merely most ordinary, but positively battle-bred children, with coarse, brutal propensities, wicked children. She could not talk or think of anything else, and she could not speak to Levin of her misery. Levin saw she was unhappy and tried to comfort her, saying that it showed nothing bad, that all children fight. But even as he said it, he was thinking in his heart, "No, I won't be artificial and talk French with my children, but my children won't be like that. All one has to do is not spoil children, not to distort their nature, and they'll be delightful. No, my children won't be like that." He said goodbye and drove away, and she did not try to keep him. Chapter 11. In the middle of July, the elder of the village on Levin's sister's estate, about 15 miles from Pokrovo, came to Levin to report on how things were going there, and on the hay. The chief source of income on his sister's estate was from the riverside meadows. In former years, the hay had been bought by the peasants for 20 rubles the 3 acres. When Levin took over the management of the estate, he thought on examining the grasslands that they were worth more, and he fixed the price at 25 rubles the 3 acres. The peasants would not give that price, and as Levin suspected, kept off other purchasers. Then Levin had driven over himself and arranged to have the grass cut partly by hired labor, partly at a payment of a certain proportion of the crop. His own peasants put every hindrance they could in the way of this new arrangement, but it was carried out, and the first year the meadows had yielded a profit almost double the previous year, which was the 3rd year. The peasants had maintained the same opposition to the arrangement, and the hay had been cut on the same system. This year the peasants were doing all the mowing for a third of the hay crop, and the village elder had come now to announce that the hay had been cut, and that, fearing rain, they had invited the counting house clerk over, had divided the crop in his presence, and had raked together 11 stacks as the owner's share from the vague answers to his question, how much hay had been cut on the principal meadow. From the hurry of the village elder, who had made the division, not asking leave, from the whole tone of the peasant, Levin perceived that there was something wrong in the division of the hay, and made up his mind to drive over himself to look into the matter.